What if the most damaging thing to your brain isn't stress, a bad diet, or even how many hours you sleep? But this. A tiny, blinking green light on a power strip. The faint blue glow from a phone charger. A sliver of streetlight bleeding through a crack in your curtains. Welcome to the science for deep sleep. If this kind of calm exploration into the universe helps you unwind, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And wherever you are right now, whether near an ocean, a forest, a city, or somewhere quiet in between, feel free to share where you're watching or listening from. We think of darkness as nothing. The simple absence of light, an empty void waiting to be filled. But that's where we're completely wrong. The truth is, your brain doesn't see darkness as nothing. It sees it as a powerful, essential signal, a non-negotiable command that kicks off a cascade of restorative processes that are critical for your health. We've become a society that is literally dark-deprived, and we're paying the price with our energy, our mood, and our long-term health. So, we're going to explore the hidden science of why your brain demands the total absence of light. We'll uncover how even microscopic particles of light can hijack your biology. And most importantly, we'll walk through exactly what you can do to harness the incredible, rejuvenating power of true, absolute darkness. To understand why your brain is so ridiculously sensitive to light, we have to start with a question that sounds almost childish. What is darkness? On a physics level, it's simple. Darkness is just the absence of photons, the particles that make up visible light. It's not a substance, it's not an energy, it's a void. It's what's left when you flip the switch off. Easy enough. But here's where it gets wonderfully weird. A shadow can move faster than the speed of light. Now, you've probably heard that nothing can travel faster than light, and that's true. No object, no particle, no piece of information can break this cosmic speed limit. So how can a shadow pull it off? Imagine you point a massively powerful flashlight at the moon. Then, you just wave your hand in front of the lens. Your hand moves at a normal speed, but because the moon is so far away, the shadow of your hand will race across the entire lunar surface in a fraction of a second. That shadow just traveled many times faster than light. Did we just break physics? No. And the reason why is the key to this whole conversation. A shadow can move faster than light because a shadow isn't a asterisk thing. It has no mass, no energy, and it carries no information. It's just an area where light isn't, an absence. So, why the physics lesson? Because it shows us that the absence of something isn't always simple. Your brain, an ancient biological machine perfected over millennia in a world without a single LED, treats the absence of light, true darkness, as one of the most important pieces of information it can possibly get. And when we interfere with that signal, even in the smallest ways, we disrupt the very foundation of our health. The problem? A dark-deprived society. For almost all of human history, life had a simple, unbreakable rhythm. The sun came up, and the sun went down. Daylight was for doing things: hunting, building, socializing. Nighttime, a true and profound darkness broken only by fire and the moon, was for rest. Our biology, our very DNA, is woven into this ancient cycle. Our internal clocks aren't set to our watches, they're set to the sun. But in the blink of an evolutionary eye, we've completely torched that reality. We live in a world that never sleeps, lit by a relentless, 24/7 glow. We have successfully conquered the night, and in doing so, we've accidentally declared war on our own bodies. This isn't just about the bright lights of Times Square. It's about a much more sneaky form of light pollution that has invaded our most sacred space, the bedroom. Think about your own room. There's the pinprick of light from your TV's standby mode, the glowing numbers on a digital clock, the charging light on your phone, your laptop, your smartwatch, the light from a smart speaker, the power button on your air purifier. That faint but persistent glow from a streetlight that somehow finds a way through your blinds. Each one is a tiny, digital sun in your personal nighttime. We've created an environment that is fundamentally alien to our biology. We are a dark, deprived society, and the consequences are becoming alarmingly clear. We're living through a silent epidemic of sleep dysfunction. Statistics show that somewhere between 50 and 70 million adults in the U.S. have a sleep disorder. And it's not just a U.S. problem. Global surveys show a world in crisis. And this shows up in ways we've all just accepted as normal. That wired and tired feeling at 11 p.m., where you know you're exhausted, but your mind is buzzing. Dragging yourself out of bed, hitting snooze over and over, feeling just as groggy as when you turned in. The afternoon slump that has you reaching for more coffee just to function. The irritability, the brain fog, the trouble concentrating. We blame stress, work, or our diet. We think we just need more hours of sleep. But what if the problem isn't the asterisk quantity of your sleep, but the asterisk quality? And what if that quality is being systematically sabotaged by the light you're exposed to, not just before bed, but while you're asleep? This is the core conflict. Our ancient, Paleolithic biology is clashing with our 21st century tech environment. We've tricked our brains into a state of endless twilight, and they're responding exactly as they're programmed to, by staying on alert. That constant, low-level light is a whisper to the deepest parts of our brain that the sun is still up, that it's not safe to power down, that the day isn't really over. This isn't a personal failure. It's a biological mismatch. Your inability to get deep, restorative sleep isn't a weakness. It's a sign that your environment is sending your brain all the wrong signals. We've filled our nights with artificial suns, and in return, our bodies have filled our days with fatigue and anxiety. To fix this, we need to understand the hidden science of how the brain actually sees light. We need to meet the master clock. The hidden science, your brain's ancient clock. To understand why a single speck of light can cause so much trouble, we have to go deep inside the brain, to a tiny cluster of about 20,000 neurons in the hypothalamus. This area is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. Don't worry about the name, just think of it as the master clock of your body, the conductor of your biological orchestra. Every organ, every tissue, every single cell has its own little clock, ticking away on a roughly 24-hour cycle. But these millions of clocks would be total chaos without a conductor. That's the SCN's job. It makes sure your liver, your heart, and your immune system are all working from the same sheet music, doing their jobs at the right time. It dictates when you feel alert, when you feel sleepy, and when hormones should be released. So how does this master clock know what time it is? It has one main source of information it trusts above all others: light coming into your eyes. Now, you're thinking, of course, my eyes see light. But this is where the science gets really cool. For over a century, we thought the eye only had two types of light-detecting cells: rods for low-light vision and cones for color. We thought their only job was to create images. It turns out, that's not the whole story. In the early 2000s, scientists discovered a special class of cells in the retina called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or iPRGCs. These cells are a game changer. Unlike rods and cones, their main job isn't to help you see. They are a light meter for your brain. They detect the overall presence and brightness of light, and they are especially sensitive to the blue light found in daylight and, crucially, in our screens and LEDs. These iPRGCs form a direct superhighway of information from your eyes straight to your brain's master clock, the SCN. This is the non-image forming visual system. You don't have to be staring at a light for it to affect you. You don't even need to be able to *C* in the traditional sense. Studies on some blind individuals who still have working IPRGCs show that light still regulates their internal clocks, even with no conscious perception of it. This is the very mechanism that makes that tiny LED on your charger so destructive. While your rods and cones might barely notice it, your IPRGCs are wide awake, catching those photons and sending a clear signal to your master clock. It's not dark yet. Stay alert. This signal, or the lack of it, is what controls the release of the most important hormone for sleep, melatonin. Melatonin is often called the hormone of darkness, or, as sleep scientist Matthew Walker playfully calls it, the vampire hormone, because it only comes out in the dark. Here's how it works. During the day, bright light hits your eyes, the IPRGCs detect it, and they tell the SCN, it's daytime. Full power. The SCN then actively blocks the release of melatonin. Then, as the sun sets, the light hitting your eyes disappears. The IPRGCs detect this darkness. They send a nighttime signal to the SCN. The SCN gets the message and, in turn, signals a tiny, pinecone-shaped gland deep in your brain called the pineal gland. With the daytime signal gone, the pineal gland gets the green light and starts releasing melatonin into your bloodstream. This part is often misunderstood. Melatonin isn't a sleeping pill. It doesn't knock you out. As Matthew Walker describes it, melatonin is like the official who fires the starting pistol for the race of sleep. It doesn't run the race, but it officially announces to every cell in your body that it's now biological nighttime, and it's time to start preparing for sleep. It's a sleep regulator, not a sleep initiator. Now, here's the problem. What happens when, at 10 p.m., you're scrolling on your phone, or sleeping in a room that isn't pitch black? Those photons, especially the blue light from screens, hit your IPRGCs. And the IPRGCs do their job. They send a powerful, daytime signal to your SCN. The SCN gets this message and slams on the brakes. It tells the pineal gland, emergency stop, sun's up, shut down melatonin production. And the pineal gland obeys instantly. Studies show that even moderate room light can drastically suppress melatonin and shorten its duration. One study found that exposure to room light during normal sleeping hours suppressed melatonin by over 50%. Another found that even dim light during sleep was enough to increase heart rate and insulin resistance the next morning. This isn't a gentle nudge, it's a biological handbrake. Your body is left in a state of total confusion, caught between the natural drive to sleep and an artificial signal of daytime. The consequences of this circadian disruption go far beyond just feeling tired. When your master clock is constantly confused, the whole orchestra falls out of sync. First, your metabolic health suffers. When light at night messes with your melatonin rhythm, it can mess with your body's sensitivity to insulin and how you manage blood sugar. This is why countless studies now link regular exposure to light at night with a significantly higher risk of obesity, metabolic syndrome, and type 2 diabetes. Second, your mental health takes a hit. The SCN is deeply connected to the parts of your brain that control mood. Chronic disruption of your circadian rhythm is a major risk factor for depression and anxiety. It makes sense. If your fundamental rhythm of wake and sleep is in chaos, your emotional state will be, too. Bright light exposure late at night has even been shown to suppress dopamine, a key chemical for mood and motivation. Third, your immune system and cellular repair are compromised. Deep sleep is when your body and brain do their most critical cleanup work. When light at night delays or shortens these deep sleep cycles, that cleaning process gets cut short. Over time, this can lead to more inflammation and a harder time fighting off illness. So that tiny blinking light isn't so innocent. It's a vandal, spray painting, daytime, all over your brain's ancient clock. But the good news is, we can fight back. We can reclaim the night and give our brains the one thing they're screaming for: The empowering solution. Reclaiming the night. Okay, so we know that even the smallest amount of light at night causes biological chaos. What do we do about it? How do we fight back against this constant barrage of photons? Thankfully, the solution isn't about buying expensive gadgets. It's about being absolutely ruthless in creating darkness. The plan has 3 parts: your sleep environment, your evening wind down, and, believe it or not, your morning routine. Let's start with the main battlefield, your bedroom. Your mission is to turn your bedroom into a sleep cave. The goal is absolute, total darkness. So dark you can't see your hand in front of your face. This might sound extreme, but remember those IPRGCs. Your brain's light meter is way more sensitive than your conscious vision. Your most powerful weapon is a set of real blackout curtains. I don't mean heavy drapes, I mean curtains specifically designed to block 100% of light. Use a wrap-around curtain rod to eliminate that halo of light that leaks from the sides. But that's just step 1. Now, it's time for a light audit. Tonight, after it's dark, turn off all the lights in your bedroom. Close the door, draw the curtains, and just stand in the middle of the room for 5 minutes. Let your eyes fully adjust. Now, hunt for every single photon. Be relentless. Start with the obvious offenders. That glaring digital alarm clock? Turn it to face the wall, or better yet, get a simple analog one. If you use your phone, put it face down with notifications off so the screen never lights up. Now, scan the walls near your outlets. See that green light on your power strip? That's a beacon of melatonin suppression. A 1-cent piece of black electrical tape will solve this. Do the same for your TV's standby light, your laptop charger, the logo on your air purifier, and the Wi-Fi router. Every single one has to go. Look up. Got a smoke detector with a blinking light? You should never disable a smoke detector, but you can buy special light dimming stickers or use a tiny piece of tape to cover the LED without blocking the sensor. Finally, check the door. Is a sliver of light coming from the hallway? A simple draft stopper or a rolled-up towel will create a perfect seal. It might feel a little weird at first because we're so used to some light, but your brain will thank you. The second part is managing your light diet in the hours before bed. A dark cave is great, but it's useless if you've been staring into a miniature sun right before you get in. You need to create a fake sunset for your brain. The most powerful rule here is, no screens in the last hour. An hour before bed, put the phone away. Turn off the tablet and the TV. The bright, blue spectrum light from these devices is the most potent form of melatonin-suppressing light there is. Staring at your phone in bed is the biological equivalent of shining a flashlight in your eyes and yelling, "It's noon." So what do you do in this screen-free hour? Read a real book. Listen to a podcast or calm music. Stretch. Talk with your partner. The activity matters less than what you're not doing, flooding your eyes with blue light. If you absolutely must use a screen, use harm reduction. Turn on your device's night mode, and turn the brightness all the way down.
Better yet, get a pair of quality blue light blocking glasses. The ones with orange or red lenses are most effective. But remember, these are crutches. The best solution is to just turn the screens off. At the same time, dim the lights in your house. Switch from bright overhead lights to low wattage, warm-toned lamps. Think campfire, not stadium lights. This brings us to our third and final step, which, paradoxically, happens in the morning. To make your darkness at night more effective, you need a blast of bright light in the morning. This concept, pushed heavily by neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman, is the other side of the coin. Your master clock responds to the asterisk contrast between light and dark. Getting bright sunlight in your eyes shortly after waking is the most powerful signal you can send to lock in your circadian rhythm for the day. It triggers a healthy morning release of cortisol to make you feel alert, and it sets a timer for melatonin to be released about 14 to 16 hours later. A strong on signal in the morning creates a stronger off signal at night. The protocol is simple. Within 30 to 60 minutes of waking, go outside. On a clear, sunny day, you need 5 to 10 minutes. On an overcast day, aim for 15 to 20 minutes. On a very gray day, you might need 30 minutes. Don't wear sunglasses. Don't look through a window or a car windshield. Glass filters out the very light your brain needs. You never want to look directly at the sun, but just be outside and let the ambient light do its work. By creating a sleep cave, managing your evening light, and getting morning sun, you're taking back control of your biology. You are replacing the chaotic signals of the modern world with the clear, ancient rhythms your brain was designed for. If this is clicking for you and you're ready to take control of your sleep and energy, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We dive into science-backed health protocols like this every week to help you optimize your mind and body. And if this made you think of someone who is always tired or struggling with sleep, please share this video with them. It might be the key they've been missing. We started this journey with a tiny, blinking LED, a seemingly innocent part of our modern world. We've traveled from a physics paradox to the deepest parts of our brain and discovered a profound truth: darkness is not nothing. It is a biological necessity. It's the signal that gives your brain permission to rest, repair, and rejuvenate. We've learned that our bodies are run by a master clock, the SCN, which syncs our internal world with the daily cycle of light and dark. We've uncovered the eye's hidden light meter, the IPRGCs, which make our brains incredibly sensitive to even the dimmest light. And we've seen how artificial light at night hijacks this system, slams the brakes on melatonin, and throws our entire body into chaos. But we've also learned that we are not helpless. The solution isn't to abandon modern life, but to become the masters of our own environment. The power is in a roll of electrical tape. It's in the decision to put down your phone and pick up a book. It's in the simple act of stepping outside for a few minutes each morning. These aren't small things. They are powerful statements to your own biology. We live in a world that glorifies being on 24/7. But our biology tells an older, wiser story. The biggest gains in your energy, mood, and health might not come from a new supplement or workout plan. They might just come from finally embracing the profound, restorative power of nothing, the power of absolute darkness. So I'll leave you with a question. What's the one source of light in your bedroom that's the hardest to get rid of? A stubborn power button? Light from under the door? Let's share tips and tricks in the comments below. Let's help each other build our sleep caves and take back our health, one photon at a time. Part 2. How the human eye detects light and darkness. Now, if darkness can influence the brain so deeply, the next question becomes very simple. How does the body even know that darkness has arrived? It feels obvious at first. We open our eyes, we see less, and somehow the rest of us gets the message. But what sounds simple from the outside is actually the work of one of the most delicate and remarkable systems in the human body. Because your eyes do not merely look out at the world, they translate it. They take a rain of tiny particles of light, something as silent and intangible as photons, and turn that invisible rain into color, shape, contrast, motion, and eventually meaning. And in the absence of that rain, they do something just as extraordinary. They begin to listen for darkness. If you have ever stepped from a bright afternoon into a dim room, you already know this feeling. At first, the room seems almost blind. The corners vanish. Objects flatten into shadows. You may pause at the doorway for a moment, waiting for the scene to slowly return. A chair emerges. Then the outline of a table. Then the far wall. The room was always there. Nothing in it changed. What changed was the way your eyes gathered light, and the way your brain learned how to use the little that remained. That slow return is one of the quiet miracles of being alive. To understand it, it helps to imagine the eye not as a simple camera, but as a living, layered instrument. Light enters first through the cornea, the clear curved surface at the front of the eye. Then it passes through the pupil, that dark circle in the center. The pupil looks black, but it is not a black object. It is simply an opening, a doorway. Around it sits the iris, the colored ring that gently expands or contracts to change how much light is allowed in. This is the part most people know. Bright light, small pupil. Dim light, larger pupil. And that is true, but it is only the beginning. Because the pupil is not the main event. It helps, certainly. It can widen in darkness to let in more light, and narrow in brightness to protect the eye. But the real magic happens much farther back, on a thin sheet of living tissue lining the inside of the eye. This is the retina. And the retina is where light truly becomes sight. The retina is easy to describe and very hard to fully appreciate. It is, in a sense, a piece of your brain that sits at the back of your eye. It is made of layers of cells, all working together to capture light, compare patterns, sharpen contrast, and begin building the visual world you experience so effortlessly. Before you consciously recognize a lamp, a doorway, a face, or the moon, the retina has already done a tremendous amount of work. And at the heart of that work are two kinds of photoreceptor cells: rods and cones. These names sound almost playful, but they are among the oldest and most important tools your body has. Cones are the cells that give you crisp detail and color. They work best in bright conditions. They help you read small text, see fine edges, and tell the difference between blue fabric and green fabric in clear daylight. They are concentrated most densely near the center of your vision, especially in a tiny region called the fovea, where sharp detail is strongest. Rods are different. Rods are the specialists of dimness. They are far more sensitive to low light than cones, but they do not give you rich color. They are better at shape, motion, and faint contrast. They are spread more heavily around the outer regions of the retina, which is one reason your peripheral vision can sometimes notice something in darkness before your direct gaze can. If you have ever tried to look directly at a faint star and found that it almost disappears, only to reappear when you look slightly to the side, you have already discovered this for yourself. The center of your vision is dominated by cones, which are wonderful in daylight but less useful when the light is scarce. The edges of your vision rely more on rods, and rods are patient creatures of the dark. So in bright noon sunlight, cones do most of the heavy lifting. They are active, precise, and confident. They tell you the sky is blue, the leaves are green, the book on your table has black letters on cream paper, and the fabric of your shirt is not quite gray, but slightly warm in tone. Rods are still there, but they are not in charge. As the light begins to fade, that balance starts to change. At dusk, the world enters a kind of visual negotiation. Cones begin to lose their advantage. Colors seem softer. Details become less certain. Reds become harder to distinguish. Blues and grays begin to dominate. The world becomes less about fine precision and more about broad shape and motion. Your rods begin to take over. This is one reason twilight feels so strange, so beautiful, and sometimes so deeply calming. It is not just emotionally different. It is visually different. The machinery of sight itself is shifting. The world is still present, but it is being translated by a different set of instruments. And this shift is not instantaneous. One of the most fascinating things about human sight is that darkness does not arrive all at once inside the eye. It arrives in stages. When you step into a dim space, your pupils widen fairly quickly. That happens in seconds. But full dark adaptation takes much longer. Often 20 minutes. Sometimes closer to 30. Why? Because rods rely on a light-sensitive pigment called rhodopsin. And in bright light, this pigment gets broken down, or what scientists often describe as bleached. That does not mean damaged beyond repair. It means it has been used and needs time to regenerate. In bright daylight, you do not need maximum rod sensitivity, so that is not a problem. But when you move into darkness, your eyes need time to rebuild that sensitivity. So the darkness itself is not enough. Your eyes must recover into it. This is why a single bright flash at night can feel so disruptive. A passing car, a phone screen, the bathroom light, even one brief burst of brightness can partially reset the process. It does not mean you go all the way back to zero, but it can absolutely steal some of the sensitivity you were slowly building. This is also why astronomers, sailors, and people who work in dim environments have long respected the dark in a way modern life often forgets. They know that night vision is fragile. It is something the eye earns gradually and can lose quickly. In fact, there is a practical trick hidden inside that knowledge. Red light tends to interfere less with rod-based night vision than white or blue-rich light. That is why darkrooms, observatories, and some control panels have often used dim red illumination. It is not just aesthetic. It is biological strategy. It allows people to see enough to function without fully sacrificing their adaptation to darkness. And that detail reveals something lovely about the eye. It is not simply built to see as much as possible, all the time. It is built to adjust, to compromise, to choose what kind of seeing matters in a particular environment. In bright light, it chooses precision. In darkness, it chooses sensitivity. There is a trade-off here, and your body makes it quietly, without asking you. This is why darkness has a texture, not just emotionally, but visually. When light fades, the world loses certain kinds of information and preserves others. Fine print becomes difficult, color recedes, but movement, outline, and atmosphere become more pronounced. A tree at night may lose its individual leaves but gain a kind of silhouette dignity. A hallway in darkness may hide detail but reveal shape. A face in low light becomes less about complexion and more about contour. The eye does not stop working in darkness. It changes its priorities. And once you realize that, many ordinary experiences begin to feel more meaningful. Think about the moment when you wake in the middle of the night. At first, the room is almost unreadable. Then, slowly, you begin to sense its geometry. The ceiling is faintly there. The curtain edge becomes visible. The dresser appears as a block of deeper shadow. You are not seeing the room the way you would at noon, but you are seeing it. The rods are gathering what little light is available, and your brain is making a world out of fragments. Or think about a campfire. The fire does something peculiar to vision. It creates extreme contrast. Close to the flame, faces glow warmly. A few steps beyond, the forest or the field falls away into blackness. Your eyes are forced to negotiate two worlds at once, brightness and darkness, detail and suggestion. It is one reason firelight feels ancient. It returns the eye to a visual rhythm it knew for most of human history. For nearly all of our species' existence, nights were not flooded with consistent artificial light. There was the sun, then there was dusk, then there was darkness, broken maybe by moonlight, starlight, embers, or flame. The human eye evolved inside that cycle. It learned brightness from day and sensitivity from night. It learned that darkness was not empty. Darkness was simply a different mode of attention. And that mode of attention matters more than we usually realize. Because the eye does not only measure what is present, it is exquisitely sensitive to contrast. It is constantly asking not just, how much light is there, but also, how is that light changing? Dawn is not only bright, it is brightening. Dusk is not only dim, it is dimming. A lamp in a dark room is not only visible, it is dominant. A tiny LED on a charger may seem trivial to your conscious mind, but against a dark adapted visual system, it can become surprisingly loud. That is an important word here. Loud. We usually think of sound as loud or quiet, not light. But biologically, small lights at night can be visually loud because the rest of the environment has become so dark. A single pinpoint of brightness in a daylit room is forgettable. The same point at 2 in the morning can feel strangely powerful. Your rods have adapted. Your pupils have widened. Your system has leaned into darkness. In that state, contrast becomes everything. This is why people often underestimate bedroom light pollution. They imagine that because a light is small, it must be harmless. But the eye does not judge it the way the thinking mind does. It judges it in context. And in darkness, context magnifies everything. Another beautiful detail of the retina is that it begins processing visual information before that information ever reaches conscious awareness. Long before you say to yourself, "The room is dark," the retina has already been sorting edges from gradients, emphasizing contrast, and sending signals through the optic nerve. This means that seeing is not passive. The eye is not a window. It is a translator. It edits. It prioritizes. It selects. And that helps explain a curious truth. We do not really see light itself. We see light reflected from surfaces. We see what photons do when they strike the world and return to us altered. That lamp on the table, that white ceiling, that blanket across the bed, that silver edge of moonlight on the floor, all of it exists for you only because light touched matter and came back carrying information. Darkness, then, is not simply the absence of vision. It is a reduction of available information. And the eye responds to that reduction with incredible creativity. When information drops, the visual system leans more heavily on sensitivity, pattern recognition, and expectation. This is why shadows at night can sometimes feel animate. A coat on a chair briefly becomes a figure. A branch outside the window seems to move with intention. The eye is doing its best with partial data, and the brain, eager to make sense of incomplete scenes, supplies possibilities. This is not a defect. It is the cost of survival. It is better, from an evolutionary perspective, to occasionally mistake a harmless shape for something important than to overlook something that matters. Better to overdetect than underdetect. In darkness, caution once kept people alive. That ancient caution is still with us. And yet there is another side to darkness as well. Once the eye fully adapts and the environment remains stable, darkness can become profoundly soothing. Not because we see nothing, but because the demand on visual attention begins to soften. The world offers fewer details to chase, fewer colors, fewer hard edges, less novelty. Vision becomes gentler, broader, more atmospheric. For a species now surrounded by screens, signs, headlights, and illuminated clocks, that gentleness may be one of the most overlooked forms of rest. We often talk about resting the body, resting the mind, but there is such a thing as resting the eyes from constant visual insistence. Modern light does not merely help us see, it invites constant evaluation. Read this. Notice that. Respond now. Look again. Tap here. The visual world becomes crowded with demand. Natural darkness reduces that demand. And your eyes feel it. They widen. They slow. They stop chasing color and begin receiving shape. They stop insisting on total clarity and begin accepting atmosphere. They surrender the sharp certainties of daylight and move into a softer conversation with the world. There is science in that, real biology. But there is also something almost poetic about it. The eye, for all its brilliance, is not designed to conquer the night in the way a machine might. It does not blast through darkness. It adapts to it. It becomes humble in it. It says, in effect, there is less light now, so I will become more sensitive. There is less information now, so I will gather what I can. There is less certainty now, so I will work more slowly, more carefully, and in a different way. That is not failure. That is wisdom. And if this quiet kind of science helps you settle in, you can always leave a like, subscribe, or simply stay here a little longer. These slower journeys are made for nights exactly like this. There is one more detail worth lingering on before we move forward. In total darkness, truly total darkness, the eye reaches a limit. It cannot create visual information out of nothing. There must be some light, however faint, for rods to work with. Starlight, moonlight, the tiniest leak under a door, the faintest reflection from a wall. The eye can do astonishing things with very little, but it cannot do anything with absolutely nothing. And that matters because it reminds us of the boundary between the eye and the brain. The eye is the instrument. It gathers. It adapts. It translates. But it does not decide what the darkness means. That comes next. Because once the eye has done its work, once rods and cones and retinal circuits have sorted the night from the day, those signals must travel deeper inward, toward parts of the brain that are listening very carefully for one simple message. Has the light gone? Is it finally night? That is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because the brain does not treat light as mere illumination. It treats it as timing, as instruction, as a command about when to stay alert, when to soften, and when to begin the long, delicate descent into sleep. And that is where we go next. Before we leave this part behind, though, I'd love to leave one gentle question hanging in the dark with you. When was the last time you sat somewhere dim enough to let your eyes fully adjust and simply noticed how the world changed? Not brighter, not sharper, just different. If a memory comes to mind, you can always leave it in the comments. For now, just imagine the room around you growing softer, your eyes asking less of the world, and the world asking less of you in return. In daylight, sight is busy. In darkness, it becomes patient. And sometimes patience is the beginning of rest. Part 3. Why the brain treats light as a signal. What makes light so powerful is not simply that it helps you see. That is the part we notice. Light reveals the room, outlines the walls, lets us find the door, the book, the glass of water at the bedside. It makes the world visible, and because that function is so obvious, we often assume it is the whole story. We think light is for sight, and darkness is what remains when sight becomes difficult. But deep inside the brain, light means something much larger than visibility. To the brain, light is timing. It is instruction. It is a message about where you are in the day, how alert you should feel, how your body should behave, when your organs should speed up, when your mind should soften, and eventually, when sleep should begin to feel possible. And once you begin to see light this way, not as brightness but as biological information, a great many things in modern life start to make more sense. Why a bright morning can make you feel more awake before the coffee even has time to work. Why a restless evening in front of a glowing screen can leave the mind strangely alert, even when the body is tired. Why a dim hotel room in the middle of the afternoon can make time feel vague and your energy feel oddly suspended. Why a child can resist sleep under artificial light even after a long day. Why shift work can feel so deeply unnatural. Why jet lag can make the body feel almost betrayed. Because the brain is not merely looking at light, it is reading it. In the oldest chapters of human life, this made perfect sense. Long before clocks, calendars, electric bulbs, or phone screens, there was one signal more reliable than any other. Day arrived. Night followed. Light rose, changed color, softened, disappeared, and returned. It did this with extraordinary consistency. Clouds could shift the details. Storms could dim the sky. Seasons could stretch or compress the day. But the pattern itself remained. Morning came. Evening came. The dark followed the light, and the light returned after the dark. If you were a brain trying to survive in that world, it would have been almost impossible not to build yourself around that pattern. And that is exactly what happened. The human brain evolved inside a planet-wide rhythm of brightness and darkness so dependable that it became the master reference point for life itself. A heart may beat on its own. A stomach may digest on its own. A liver may release energy on its own. But all of them benefit enormously from knowing what time it is in the larger biological sense. Not clock time in the modern sense, but environmental time. Daytime, nighttime, dawn, dusk, the opening of activity, the closing of it. The brain needed a reliable way to measure that, and light became the ruler. This is one of the quietest and most important truths in biology. The body does not want to make major decisions blindly. It does not want to guess when to be hungry, when to be mentally sharp, when to cool down, when to prepare for rest, when to repair tissues, when to adjust hormones, when to expect food, and when to conserve energy. Guessing poorly is expensive, so the body uses the outside world to stay synchronized. And among all the clues the environment offers, light is the clearest. Food can be irregular. Temperature can vary. Activity can be inconsistent. Noise is unpredictable. But daylight, despite seasonal change, is still the most dependable cue the brain can trust. That is why light has such authority over us. It is not just another input. It is the input that helped organize the others. You can think of the brain as living with two jobs at once. One job is immediate and practical. See the path. Recognize the face. Avoid the branch. Find the berries. Notice the movement in the grass. That is the familiar visual role of light, the one we consciously appreciate. But the second job is slower, deeper, and less obvious. The brain must constantly answer a question that every living organism faces, whether it knows it or not. What phase of the world am I in right now? Am I in the rising phase of day, when energy should climb? Am I in the middle of active light, when attention should be strong? Am I in late afternoon, when the day begins to decline? Or am I in true night, when a different physiology should take over? The brain cannot answer that by introspection alone. It needs evidence, so it listens to light, and not just to light in the broadest sense, but to patterns within light, brightness, duration, timing, angle, even color. Morning light is not the same as midday light. Evening light is not the same as morning light. Firelight is not the same as daylight. A lamp is not the same as sunrise, even if to our conscious mind both simply seem bright enough to see by. The sky itself changes character over the course of a day, and the brain has learned to interpret those changes. Morning light often carries a different spectral balance than late evening light. Midday light tends to be richer in shorter wavelengths, especially blue-rich light scattered across the sky. This is not why blue light should be feared in some dramatic, simplistic way. It is simply why the brain came to associate certain kinds of light with daytime alertness. The sky taught it that lesson over millions of mornings. This is worth lingering over, because it reveals how deeply ecological the brain really is. Your brain is not just a machine sealed inside your skull. It is a pattern reader shaped by the planet. It expects certain signals because Earth kept giving them. It expects morning to brighten. It expects evening to dim. It expects darkness to last for a meaningful stretch of time. It expects contrast between day and night. When that contrast is strong, the system works more clearly. When the contrast becomes blurred, the brain becomes less certain. And uncertainty, in biology, usually means compromise. That is why the modern world is so unusual. We have created light that ignores sunset. Light that appears at will. Light that stays cold and bright at midnight. Light that can mimic noon inside a room long after the sky has gone black. Light that enters the eye from inches away through a phone held over a pillow. Light that the ancient brain cannot neatly classify. From the point of view of technology, this is convenience. From the point of view of biology, it is mixed messaging. And the brain, when given mixed messages, does what any good interpreter does. It hesitates. It delays. It becomes less decisive about whether the day is truly over. This is why someone can feel exhausted and alert at the same time. The body may be ready for rest in one sense, but the light environment is still arguing for wakefulness. The result is not a simple on or off state. It is friction. And so, if we want to understand why darkness matters, we first have to understand why the brain takes light so seriously. At the center of this lies a simple fact. Light reaches the eye, but it does not stop there. In the last part, we talked about rods and cones, about how the retina translates light into neural information. That information then begins traveling deeper into the nervous system. Some of it contributes to the rich visual world you consciously experience, but some of it serves a quieter purpose. It goes to brain systems that are less interested in the detailed picture of the world and more interested in the state of the world. Not, what am I looking at? But, what kind of time is this? This distinction matters. Imagine two kinds of seeing. One is scene seeing. It tells you that there is a lamp on the table, a jacket on the chair, a tree outside the window. The other is time seeing. It tells the body that the environment is bright enough to count as day, dim enough to count as evening, or dark enough to count as night. The first kind of seeing gives you objects. The second kind gives you rhythm. And rhythm is one of the deepest needs any organism has. You can see this everywhere in life. Plants open and close. Birds begin calling before sunrise. Insects emerge at certain hours. Flowers bloom with astonishing timing. Even tiny organisms with no brain at all respond to cycles of light and dark. Human beings like to think we stand apart from this, but in truth we remain beautifully entangled with it. We just cover the sky with glass, concrete, and electricity and then act surprised when our internal rhythms begin to wobble. The brain does not treat light as a signal because it is fragile or fussy. It treats light as a signal because that is what light has always been. A sunrise is not only beautiful, it is a biological announcement. A sunset is not only atmospheric, it is a lowering curtain. Daylight says, in effect, the external world is active now. Align yourself accordingly. Darkness says, the external world is withdrawing now. Shift inward. And the brain, if given the chance, responds to both. One of the most remarkable things about this system is that the brain uses light to prepare for events before they fully happen. It does not wait for complete exhaustion to begin winding down. It uses the decline of light as an early warning. Evening light starts telling the system that night is approaching. Dawn light starts telling it that wakefulness is approaching. In other words, light helps the brain anticipate the next phase rather than merely react to it once it arrives. This anticipatory quality is the mark of an intelligent biological design. Survival often depends less on reaction than on preparation. If the body only began shifting into daytime mode once full activity had already started, it would always lag behind. If it only began shifting toward rest once complete darkness was fully established, the descent into sleep would be rougher and more abrupt. Instead, light gradients created gentle slope. Morning ramps up, evening ramps down. The body is eased between states. Artificial light has a habit of flattening those slopes. A room can remain bright right until the moment someone decides to sleep. A screen can remain inches from the eye until the final minute before the lights go off. The brain receives brightness, 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 and then suddenly darkness, as if noon had fallen off a cliff into midnight. Sometimes it manages. Human biology is adaptable. But adaptation is not the same as ideal function. Often there is a residue of confusion. The mind is tired, but not quiet. The body lies down, but does not fully believe the day has ended. This is also why morning light matters so much. A strong morning signal helps draw a clear line between night and day. It tells the brain, with authority, that the active phase has begun. And when day is defined clearly, night often becomes easier to define as well. The body loves contrast. Bright days, dark nights, not endless twilight. There is something deeply calming in this idea, because it means the system is not as mysterious as it sometimes feels. It responds to signals. Give it clearer ones, and it often responds more clearly in return. Light influences more than alertness, too. It is tied to mood, body temperature, timing of hunger, cognitive performance, and emotional steadiness. A badly timed light environment can make a person feel strange in ways they cannot easily name. Slightly off, slightly restless, slightly flattened, slightly wired, slightly delayed inside themselves. Not dramatically ill, just out of tune. That phrase may be the most useful one here. Out of tune. Because the brain is not trying merely to stay alive moment to moment. It is trying to stay in tune with the world that shaped it. Light is the tuning fork. And when the timing of light becomes muddy, many systems begin drifting by degrees. Not always enough to cause disaster, but enough to erode clarity. Enough to weaken the difference between waking and winding down. Enough to make evenings feel less like descent and more like extension. Enough to make mornings feel less like beginnings and more like interruptions. The brain does not hate artificial light. That would be too simple. It just cannot fully ignore what light implies. A bright kitchen at midnight may help you wash dishes. A phone may help you send a message. A hallway light may help you find your way. These are real advantages. But the biology beneath them still receives photons as evidence. And evidence changes behavior. This is why even dim or ordinary-looking light can matter, especially when it arrives at the wrong time. It is not always the intensity alone. It is the timing. A modest light during the day may barely matter because it competes with stronger daylight and fits the general message of wakefulness. The same modest light in the middle of the night can become far more meaningful because it interrupts a period when the brain expects darkness. Context again. The body is always reading context. And that reading is not emotional or moral. Light is not good, and darkness is not good in some absolute sense. Their meaning depends on timing. Brightness in morning can be helpful. Brightness at night can be disruptive. Darkness at midnight can be restorative. Darkness at noon can be disorienting. The brain is not asking whether light exists. It is asking whether it makes sense right now. That is a gentler and more accurate way to think about the science. Not fear. Not rules for their own sake. Simply timing. Good timing creates coherence. Poor timing creates contradiction. And the brain, like any good conductor, prefers coherence. If you have ever watched a child fall asleep during a car ride in late afternoon light, or felt a wave of calm as the sun sank and indoor lights remained low, or felt weirdly stimulated by overhead lighting in the late evening, you have already met this system in your own life. It is not abstract. It is intimate. It shapes everyday feeling. You can even sense it on weekends or vacations. Spend a few evenings in a place with softer nights, fewer screens, and a more natural sunset rhythm, and many people begin to notice something they had forgotten was possible. Their sleepiness feels less forced. Their tiredness arrives with a certain softness. Their mind does not need to be argued into sleep quite so much. The descent feels more organic. That is often the brain responding gratefully to signals it understands. And if this calm kind of exploration is becoming part of your own evening ritual, you can always subscribe, leave a like, or simply stay with the story a little longer. There is no rush here. There is another reason the brain values light so highly, and it is almost philosophical in its elegance. Light is external. It comes from outside the body. That means it offers a check against the mind's private confusion. You may lose track of time indoors. You may become absorbed in work. You may nap too late, wake disoriented, and not know whether it is morning or evening for a few seconds. But light, when allowed in, tells the truth. The sky clarifies. Morning light says morning, regardless of your mood. Sunset says evening, regardless of your schedule. The brain trusts signals that do not depend on your opinion. That is why natural light can feel so grounding. It reintroduces honesty. It reminds the body what phase of the world it is in. And perhaps that is one reason modern life can feel so drifting. Much of it happens in controlled indoor brightness that changes little from hour to hour. Offices, stores, airports, hallways, and screens create environments where visual time is flattened. Noon can resemble evening. Evening can resemble afternoon. Midnight can resemble a brightly lit waiting room. The brain can still function in such places, of course. but it receives weaker cues, or contradictory ones. And over time, weaker cues often mean weaker rhythm. None of this means a person must live by candlelight or fear every bulb. That is not the point. The point is simply to understand the language the brain already speaks. Once you know that light is read as timing, not just visibility, you can begin to shape your environment with a little more kindness. Morning brightness becomes a tool. Evening dimness becomes a gift. Darkness stops being a void and becomes a signal the body has been waiting for. And beneath all of this sits one of the most important structures in the story, the brain's internal timing system, the one that takes these light cues and uses them to organize the body's daily rhythm. We have brushed against it already, but now it deserves our full attention. Because the brain does not just notice light, it keeps score with it. It measures the day. It uses light to decide when night truly begins. And when the light finally fades enough, and stays gone long enough, that ancient system begins one of the most beautiful transitions in human biology. The world outside goes dim, and the body starts leaning inward towards sleep. That is where we go next. And before we do, there is a small question I'd love to leave with you tonight. When do you usually get your clearest sense that the day is actually ending? Is it the sunset outside, the dimming of the room, the moment you put your phone away, or something else entirely? Sometimes that answer reveals more about our relationship with light than we expect. For now, just let this thought settle. The brain does not need light only to see the world. It needs light to know when to be part of it, and darkness to know when to gently let it go. Part 4. The Body Clock and the Rise of Melatonin. If light is the message, then somewhere inside the brain there must be a listener. Some quiet keeper of time. Some structure small enough to go unnoticed in daily life, yet powerful enough to influence when you feel alert, when you feel hungry, when your body begins to cool, when your mind becomes heavy, and when sleep begins to feel less like a decision and more like a tide coming in. And there is. Deep in the brain, tucked within a region called the hypothalamus, there is a tiny cluster of cells that acts as one of the body's central timekeepers. Its name is technical, a little clumsy, and far less poetic than the role it plays. It is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, often shortened to the SCN. You do not need to remember the name if you do not want to. What matters is what it does. It keeps time by listening to light. Or, more accurately, it helps the body keep time by interpreting the pattern of light and darkness that comes in through the eyes. This little structure is astonishingly small. If you saw it in a textbook, it would not look grand or dramatic. It is not some glowing clock face buried in the skull. It is a modest cluster of neurons. Quiet, unassuming. Yet from that tiny place, signals ripple outward into the rest of the body, helping coordinate a daily cycle so deep and so ancient that nearly every organ follows it. Your body is not doing the same thing at 3 in the afternoon that it is doing at 3 in the morning, even if you happen to be awake for both. Your hormone patterns are different. Your core temperature is different. Your digestive readiness is different. Your alertness is different. Your metabolism behaves differently. Your tendency towards sleep is different. Even your cells, in their own subtle ways, follow rhythms. And all of these rhythms need some kind of master timing signal if they are going to stay coordinated. Otherwise, life becomes biological jazz with no conductor. One system preparing for day while another still thinks it is night. One organ accelerating while another tries to rest. The SCN helps prevent that confusion. You can think of it as a conductor, but not in the dramatic, noisy sense. More in the quiet orchestral sense. It does not force every instrument to play the same note. It simply helps each section enter at the right time. That alone is beautiful. But what makes it even more remarkable is how it sets itself. Unlike a mechanical clock on a wall, which must be wound or powered, the body clock is living. It has its own internal rhythm, a roughly 24-hour cycle generated by feedback loops within cells. Even if a person were placed in constant dim conditions with no sunrise, no sunset, and no regular schedule, many of these rhythms would continue for some time. The body carries time within itself, but it does not carry perfect time. Left entirely alone, the internal clock tends to drift. For many people, it runs slightly longer than 24 hours. Not wildly longer, just a little. Enough that over days and weeks, without environmental correction, sleep and wake timing can gradually slide later or sometimes earlier depending on the person and the conditions. So the body's clock is real, but it is not meant to exist in isolation. It is meant to be corrected by the world. And the most important correcting signal is light. Morning light helps nudge the system into alignment. Evening darkness helps confirm that the active phase is ending. Day after day, the environment and the brain enter into this quiet conversation. The brain says, "Here is where I think I am in the cycle." The sky replies, "Here is where the planet actually is." And with that exchange, the body stays synchronized not just with itself, but with Earth. There is something almost tender about that. Your sleep is not merely a private habit. It is partly a relationship between your nervous system and the turning of the planet. Now, if the SCN is the keeper of daily timing, then one of the most famous chemicals it helps regulate is melatonin. Melatonin is often spoken about as if it were a sleeping drug made naturally by the body. That is close enough for everyday conversation, but it misses the deeper truth. Melatonin does not simply make you sleep in the blunt way people often imagine. It is more elegant than that. Melatonin is a signal of biological night. It is the body's quiet announcement that darkness has lasted long enough, and consistently enough, that the internal environment should begin shifting toward rest. That is why some people call it the hormone of darkness. Not because darkness contains melatonin, of course, but because darkness allows melatonin to rise. And that distinction matters. The brain does not treat melatonin as a sedative hammer. It uses it more like a dimmer switch and a timing cue. Melatonin tells the body, gently but firmly, it is night now. Begin behaving accordingly. That can include increased sleepiness, but it also includes broader changes in physiology. The body begins leaning inward. Certain kinds of alertness soften. Temperature trends shift. Biological processes associated with nighttime become more likely. It is not a single switch being flipped. It is a coordinated transition. And transitions are the heart of this whole story. Because most of the body's deepest rhythms are not about extremes. They are about movement between states. Waking to sleeping. Feeding to fasting. Activity to repair. Exposure to withdrawal. Day to night. The beauty of the circadian system is that it helps smooth those movements so they happen with order rather than chaos. Melatonin is part of that order. To understand how this works, it helps to picture the sequence. Light enters the eyes, especially the kinds of light patterns the retina is well equipped to measure. Those signals travel inward to the SCN. The SCN reads the light environment and, based on its timing, helps regulate whether the body should behave more like it is in daytime or nighttime mode. Among the many downstream effects of this is the regulation of the pineal gland, a small gland deep in the brain that releases melatonin when darkness has signaled that night has truly arrived. In bright daytime, melatonin stays suppressed. As evening deepens and darkness persists, melatonin begins to rise. Then, later in the night or toward morning, as the internal cycle continues and light begins returning, melatonin falls again. It is a rhythm, not a constant presence. Not a chemical that is meant to sit high in the bloodstream all day. It rises and falls like part of a larger wave. This is why the timing of melatonin matters just as much as the amount. A rise at the wrong time is not the same as a rise at the right time. The body does not only care whether a signal exists, it cares when it arrives. There is a lovely analogy here. Imagine an orchestra waiting for the conductor's cue. A violin section that plays beautifully but enters 10 minutes late is still out of sync. A drum beat that arrives at the wrong moment can throw off the entire piece. Biology is like that. Timing is not everything, but it is very close. And melatonin is one of the body's most important timing cues. This is also why people often misunderstand what they are feeling in the evening. There is tired, and then there is circadian night pressure, if we want to put it gently. A person can feel physically worn out from a long day and still have a system that is not fully ready for sleep. Another person can feel emotionally wired but have melatonin rising quietly underneath that restlessness. The experience of sleepiness is not just one signal. It is a blend of accumulated fatigue and circadian timing. That blend is one reason modern life can feel so strange at night. You may know the feeling. You have been awake all day. Your eyes are tired. Your shoulders are heavy. Part of you is clearly exhausted. But after a bright room, a laptop, overhead lighting, and a phone screen held near your face, your mind still seems to resist the descent. You are tired, but not received by sleep. Sleep feels delayed, as if the body has not yet accepted the invitation. That can happen for many reasons, of course. Stress, worry, stimulants, habit. But light timing is often one of the hidden players. If the SCN is still receiving the rough message that it is day, or not fully night, then melatonin may not rise as strongly or as cleanly as the body would prefer. The result is not always obvious. It is often subtle. The person does not think, my circadian timing is being blurred. They think, why am I so tired and yet somehow not ready? That question is the modern condition in miniature. We have become very good at extending the visible day. We are less skilled at noticing the cost of extension. For most of human history, the transition from day to night was gradual and convincing. The sky dimmed, color drained from the landscape. Firelight and moonlight offered some visibility, but they did not fully replace the authority of daylight. Darkness had weight. It was unmistakable. It told the body, without ambiguity, that a different physiological chapter had begun. Now many people move from bright afternoon into bright evening into bright indoor night, and only much later into darkness. The body can adapt, yes. Human beings are resilient. But again, adaptation is not the same as effortless harmony. Often there is a mismatch between the ancient timing system and the modern lighting environment. And melatonin, because it depends so much on darkness and timing, sits right in the center of that mismatch. This is one reason why the phrase, the rise of melatonin, is such a good one. It really is a rise, a curve, a gradual emergence, not an instant command, but a building signal. The best conditions for that rise are usually simple, though not always easy in modern life. Bright enough days, dimmer evenings, darkness that is not constantly interrupted, a consistent enough rhythm that the body begins to trust the sequence. Trust may sound like a strange word for biology, but it fits. The body trusts patterns. When light arrives regularly in the morning, when meals happen in a somewhat predictable range, when sleep and waking do not move chaotically every few days, the circadian system begins to feel more anchored. Not perfect. Human life is never perfect, but more anchored. The body starts anticipating instead of merely reacting, and anticipation makes biological life smoother. It is one thing to collapse into sleep because you have forced yourself there. It is another thing entirely to feel the body begin preparing, in advance, for rest. To notice that your eyes soften at roughly the same time, that the mind becomes quieter with less effort. That sleep begins to feel like a natural continuation rather than an argument. That is often what clearer circadian timing looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, just smoother. There is another important detail here, one that people sometimes discover accidentally. Melatonin does not only respond to the presence or absence of light in a crude way. It responds to the pattern across time. One night of bright light may not ruin a person's whole rhythm. One dim evening may not fix everything either. The system is dynamic. It learns from repetition. It is influenced by sequences. That means the body clock is forgiving, but it also means it pays attention. A few nights of late brightness in a row can push things later. A few mornings of strong light, if timed well, can help pull things earlier. A week of travel across time zones can leave the clock confused because the environmental cues have shifted suddenly. A weekend of staying up very late under artificial light can create that strange Monday feeling where the body seems half convinced it is still on a different schedule. Anyone who has experienced jet lag already knows how deeply the body cares about timing. It is one of the clearest demonstrations that sleep is not just about being tired. On a long flight, the person may be physically exhausted, yet unable to sleep at the new local bedtime, or wide awake at 3 in the morning, or ravenous at an odd hour, or mentally foggy even when technically rested. That is the body clock revealing itself. It is saying, I still believe I am somewhere else in the cycle. And the way it gets retrained is, again, through cues. Especially light. Light in the new morning. Darkness in the new night. Repeated enough for the brain to accept the shift. That same principle applies in smaller ways at home. A bedroom full of scattered LEDs, streetlight bleeding through curtains, a TV still glowing in standby mode, a phone checked again at midnight, an overhead bathroom light switched on in the middle of the night, a brightly lit kitchen after an already long evening. None of these has to be catastrophic in isolation, but together they create a pattern of weaker night signals and stronger late light signals than the circadian system was built for. The body, in effect, hears too much daytime language too late, and melatonin waits. There is something strangely reassuring in knowing this, because it makes the body feel less mysterious and less faulty. People often blame themselves for poor sleep in moral language. I'm bad at sleeping. My brain is broken. I should be able to switch off. But the body is often not being difficult. It is responding logically to the cues it has been given. Bright light late, mixed signals, uncertain night, delayed melatonin, dim evening, clear darkness, more convincing night, better rise. There is no shame in biology, only pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can begin working with it instead of against it. That does not mean perfection. It does not mean a rigid life controlled by sunset charts and absolute rules. It means kindness to the system, respect for timing, a little less brightness late, a little more darkness when darkness is supposed to happen, a little more morning light if the days have become too indoor and dim, enough consistency that the body starts to recognize the rhythm again. One of the most restful things about all of this is that your body already knows how to sleep. It already knows how to generate the cues, the hormones, the temperature shifts, the timing patterns. The intelligence is there. The system is not something you must build from nothing. More often, it is something you remove obstacles from. That, perhaps, is one of the gentlest ways to understand circadian health. Not as forcing the body into compliance, but as letting the body do the old, brilliant thing it was designed to do. Listen to light. Measure the day. Release melatonin into the dark. Lean towards sleep. If this part of the journey is helping you settle a little deeper into the night, you can always subscribe, leave a like, or even share where in the world you are listening from. It is always quietly beautiful to imagine all of us under different skies, still shaped by the same turning planet. There is another subtle aspect of melatonin that deserves a moment of attention. Because melatonin is often sold as a supplement, many people naturally assume it works like a stronger version of the body's own chemical. Sometimes it can be helpful, and sometimes not. But what matters most for our story is that the body's own melatonin is part of a broader rhythm. It is embedded in a conversation between the eyes, the brain, darkness, and timing. It is not just a substance to be added. It is a signal that means something because of when it appears. That is why people can sometimes take melatonin and still feel oddly out of step if the rest of the light environment is chaotic. The signal alone does not fully replace the pattern that is supposed to support it. Biology works best in systems, not isolated hacks. The body wants timing coherence. And when it gets that coherence, something wonderful begins to happen. Sleep stops feeling like a cliff and starts feeling like a slope. The brain no longer has to be dragged toward rest quite so abruptly. It begins descending in advance. Evening feels different in the body, not just on the clock. You might notice it as a softening of thought, a slight heaviness behind the eyes, a desire for lower voices, dimmer rooms, slower movement, less appetite for stimulation, a quiet sense that the day is loosening its grip. Those are not failures of productivity. They are signs that the body is entering the correct chapter. Modern life often teaches us to ignore those signs, to override them, to keep going under bright light and digital stimulation as if the body clock were optional. But it is not optional. It can be delayed, confused, ignored, or pushed around. But it does not disappear. It waits beneath the surface, still keeping score, still responding, still hoping for a clearer signal. And this is what makes darkness so powerful. Darkness is not just the absence of visual input. It is permission. Permission for the body clock to say, with confidence, now. Permission for melatonin to rise. Permission for nighttime physiology to unfold without contradiction. That permission may be one of the most overlooked luxuries in the modern world. Not expensive sheets, not supplements, not devices, just a convincing night. A night dark enough and calm enough that the internal clock believes it. As the body clock begins to settle into that darkness, another part of the story begins to matter more and more. Because once melatonin rises and the night signal is established, the real question becomes what happens next. What does artificial light do when it interrupts that transition? How much light is enough to confuse the system? Why can such small sources of brightness seem biologically louder than they look? That is where we go next. But before we move on, I want to leave you with one quiet image. Somewhere inside you, right now, there is a tiny cluster of cells keeping planetary time. Not social time, not work time, not phone time. Planetary time. It is listening for light, waiting for darkness, and trying to guide the rest of you through a rhythm older than language. In a world that often asks us to stay switched on without pause, that little clock is still trying to lead us back to night. Part 5. What artificial light does to a sleeping brain. There is a strange assumption many of us carry into the night. We assume that once we fall asleep, the brain stops paying attention. Not completely, of course. Most people know that a loud sound can wake them, or that a hand on the shoulder, a crying child, a slammed door, or a ringing phone can pull them back to consciousness. But there is still this deeper feeling that sleep is a kind of sealed room. That once the mind goes under, the outside world matters less. The body has shut the doors. The brain has gone offline. The night is no longer being monitored. But that is not really how sleep works. Sleep is not a disappearance. It is not the brain switching off like a lamp. It is a different form of activity, a different form of vigilance, a different form of communication with the world. Even in sleep, the brain is still taking in signals, still measuring the environment, still deciding, in subtle ways, whether the conditions around the body feel like real night or merely an imitation of it. It is still listening for danger, still tracking temperature, still processing sound to some degree, and yes, still responding to light. That last part is the one modern life has made especially complicated, because for most of human history, once darkness settled in, it mostly stayed settled. There might be moonlight, firelight, starlight, the glow of embers, but the night, even when not perfectly black, still had a certain honesty to it. It was recognizably different from day. Its brightness was limited. Its contrast was gentler. Its message to the nervous system was unmistakable. Now many people try to sleep in environments that are technically dark enough to close their eyes in, but biologically much noisier than they realize. A charger light glowing by the wall, a digital clock facing the bed, a television in standby, a router in the corner, a street lamp leaking through thin curtains, a hallway light under the door, a neighbor's security light flaring on and off, a phone screen lit up for one last check, a tablet resting nearby, a television left playing softly in the room. None of these may seem dramatic. That is precisely the problem. Artificial light at night is often not dramatic. It is ordinary, casual, familiar, easy to dismiss. And yet the sleeping brain does not evaluate these things the way the waking, thinking mind does. It does not say, "It is only a small blue light. It is probably fine." It responds more literally. There is light here. There is brightness where darkness should be. The signal of night is less complete than expected. The brain does not need perfect darkness to sleep at all, and human beings have always slept under a range of natural conditions. But the sleeping brain still benefits from darkness being convincing. The more the environment resembles real night, the more smoothly nighttime physiology can do what it was designed to do. The more artificial light intrudes, the more the system must work around contradiction. And contradiction is tiring. One of the most important things to understand is that the eyelids are not walls. They reduce light, certainly. They help, but they do not create absolute isolation. Anyone who has ever fallen asleep in a bright room and noticed red-orange glow through closed eyelids already knows this. Light can still reach the retina. Not as strongly as with open eyes, of course, but enough that the brain is not entirely cut off from visual information. Some kinds of light, and some intensities, matter more than others. But the broader point remains simple. The sleeping brain is not living in total sensory exile. It is still receiving clues. That means artificial light can influence the brain in two main ways. First, it can delay the proper start of nighttime physiology before you fall asleep. Second, it can continue disturbing that physiology after sleep has begun. The first one is more familiar. Many people already know that bright light late in the evening can make it harder to feel sleepy. A brightly lit room, a screen close to the face, or a strong overhead light can keep the mind feeling later than the clock suggests. Melatonin may rise less cleanly. The body may delay its descent. Sleepiness arrives later, or in a more fragile form. That part of the story has become more widely understood. But the second part is quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. Light can continue affecting the brain while you are asleep. Not always enough to wake you fully. Not always enough to create a memory of disturbance. But enough to change the quality of what is happening under the surface. And this is where things become especially important, because a person can believe they slept through the night and still have had their sleep subtly altered by the light around them. This is one of the reasons sleep can feel confusing. People often imagine sleep disruption as something obvious: tossing, turning, waking up repeatedly and looking at the clock. If none of that happens, they assume the sleep was solid. But the brain can be nudged, shifted, and pulled into lighter sleep without fully surfacing into conscious wakefulness. You may not remember those changes. Your nervous system still does. Think about how a sleeping house behaves during a storm. From outside, the house still looks quiet. The lights are off. The doors are shut. But inside, the pressure changes. The windows rattle. The structure responds. The occupants may not all wake, but the house is not unaffected by what is happening beyond its walls. The sleeping brain is like that. It does not need to burst awake to be disturbed. It only needs to be nudged away from the depth and continuity it was trying to maintain. And artificial light can be one of those nudges. There are several ways to picture this. One is to imagine the brain during sleep as trying to settle into layered depth. Nighttime is not a flat state. It has stages, rhythms, cycles. There are periods of lighter sleep, deeper sleep, dream-rich phases, and transitions between them. Ideally, these are coordinated in a way that allows repair, memory processing, emotional integration, and physical restoration to unfold with minimal interruption. Artificial light can introduce friction into that process. Not always enough to destroy it, but enough to make it less elegant, less continuous, less complete. A room that is too bright, or a sudden burst of light during the night, may increase the chances of brief arousals. These can be so short that the person never remembers them. The heart rate may shift. The nervous system may become slightly more activated. The body may rise toward alertness and then drift back down again. One such event may not matter much. Repeated little disruptions, night after night, are another story. This is part of why small lights can matter more than we expect. Their effect is not always theatrical. It is cumulative. A little contradiction here, a little intrusion there, a little less darkness than the brain would prefer. Over time, the cost appears not always as obvious insomnia, but as sleep that somehow does not restore as deeply as it should. You wake up, technically having slept, but not fully renewed by it. And this can show up in very ordinary ways. A slightly heavier morning, a subtle fog that lifts too slowly, the feeling that you were asleep, yet somehow still tired, the sense that your mind never fully settled, even though the night looked long enough on paper. This is one of the most frustrating forms of sleep trouble because it often goes unnamed. People know when they did not sleep. They are less skilled at recognizing when they slept in a compromised environment that quietly thinned the benefits of sleep. Artificial light can do that. It can make the night shallower without making it obviously broken. It can keep the brain just a little more watchful than true darkness would. It can reduce the confidence of the night signal. And confidence matters. The circadian system likes certainty. Bright daytime, dark nighttime. A sleeping brain in a convincingly dark room can relax more fully into the assumption that night is real and continuing. A brain receiving mixed signals remains, in some quiet sense, more negotiative, more conditional, less surrendered. There is another layer to this. Light at night does not only affect sleep architecture in an abstract sense. It can also influence the autonomic nervous system, the part of the nervous system involved in background regulation, including heart rate and general physiological arousal. Some research suggests that sleeping in the presence of light can lead the body to remain slightly more activated than it otherwise would. Not panicked, not necessarily awake, just less fully in the restful physiological mode darkness tends to support. This detail matters because sleep is not only about unconsciousness. It is also about the body entering certain states that support repair. If the body remains subtly more alert beneath the surface, even without waking you, the quality of rest can change. Imagine trying to repair a building while small alarms keep going off in the background. The repairs may still happen, but not as smoothly. There is still a sense that something requires monitoring. The sleeping brain under artificial light may behave a bit like that. And modern light is not like old light. That is worth saying clearly. There is a tendency to romanticize the past too much, or to imply that any non-natural light is somehow catastrophic. That is not the point. Firelight, candlelight, lanterns, moonlit windows, and city glow are all forms of nighttime illumination humans have encountered in different ways. But modern artificial light has a reach and consistency unlike anything most human nervous systems evolved with. It can be bright, close, cool in tone, and available at any hour. It can arrive directly from a screen held inches from the face or remain on all night from fixed sources in the room. It can erase the visual distinction between evening and midday far more thoroughly than older forms of light ever could. That difference matters because the brain still uses contrast to tell time, not time on a calendar. Time in a biological sense. When evening is bright, the body gets a weaker signal that night has begun. When the bedroom is never truly dark, the sleeping brain gets a weaker signal that night is being preserved. And when the brain receives weaker night signals, the night often becomes less efficient. This can affect more than just sleepiness. It can affect the texture of sleep, the stability of sleep, the depth of sleep, the feeling of restoration afterward. And then, by morning, the effects may ripple outward into the next day. A less restful night does not always announce itself dramatically, but it can show up in mood, concentration, patience, appetite, and that hard-to-define sense of being slightly less steady in yourself. This is another hidden cost of late or nighttime light. It can create a subtle chain. A little more light at night, a little poorer sleep, a little rougher morning, a little greater dependence on caffeine or stimulation, a little less natural energy, then another bright evening to compensate for tiredness or productivity demands. Then the cycle repeats. In that sense, artificial light at night does not merely disturb sleep. It can quietly become part of a lifestyle pattern in which the body never gets a fully convincing night and therefore never builds as strong a day-night contrast as it needs. And because these effects are gradual, people often normalize them. They say, "This is just how I am. I'm just not a good sleeper. I always wake up a little tired. My brain is always kind of on." Maybe. But sometimes the environment has simply become louder than the nervous system likes. One of the most common examples is the television left on during sleep. Many people find it comforting. The voices can reduce loneliness, distract from anxious thoughts, or provide a sense of company. There is nothing childish or foolish about that. It is deeply human to want soft sound and the illusion of presence at night. But from the sleeping brain's point of view, a television is not neutral. It offers changing light, changing brightness, changing colors, sudden sound shifts, emotional content, and unpredictable visual transitions. Even if you fall asleep to it easily, that does not mean the brain treats it as restful darkness. It may sleep around it, but often at some cost. The same is true of phones. A final glance turns into 10 minutes. 10 minutes becomes 20. The screen is small, but very close. The room is dark, which makes the screen feel even more dominant. The eyes receive a burst of brightness at exactly the moment the brain was hoping for a clearer night signal. Then the phone is placed face down, but still nearby. A notification lights the room later. Or the person wakes at 3 in the morning and checks the time, pulling a fresh burst of light into already adapted eyes. These moments seem tiny, and in social terms they're tiny. But biologically they are often louder than they look. And yet the solution is not fear. Fear is not restful. Fear would only add one more layer of arousal. The point is understanding. Once you understand that the sleeping brain continues to interpret light, the need for a darker environment stops feeling like perfectionism and starts feeling like cooperation with biology. Darkness becomes not a rigid rule, but a kindness. A way of reducing contradiction. A way of letting the brain stop negotiating with the possibility that day might still be happening. This is one reason blackout curtains, covered LEDs, and dimmer evening routines can be surprisingly powerful. They are not glamorous interventions. They do not feel as modern or clever as supplements, wearables, or complicated hacks. But they address something extremely basic. They make night more believable. And the brain loves believable night. If this calm exploration is helping you slow down a little, you can always subscribe, leave a like, or even share what the brightest source of nighttime light in your own room tends to be. Sometimes simply noticing it is the beginning of changing it. There is also something important to say about children here, because young brains can be especially sensitive to nighttime cues. Bedtime battles are not always only about willpower, routine, or sugar, as people jokingly say. Light matters. A brightly lit house late into the evening can send mixed signals to a child's system just as easily as to an adult's, sometimes more so. When homes get dimmer earlier, voices soften, and visual stimulation reduces, the body often finds it easier to understand that the day is actually over. Adults are not different in principle. We simply have more ways of overriding ourselves. Another subtle issue is how normalized urban glow has become. Many people no longer sleep in darkness unless they intentionally create it. Cities glow. Windows leak brightness. Parking lots shine. Exterior security lights sweep across walls. Even if someone never turns on a lamp in the bedroom, the room may still be receiving enough ambient light to blur the night. Again, this may not produce obvious insomnia, but it can create a softer version of night than the brain would naturally prefer. The solution does not have to be extreme. It can be wonderfully simple. A better curtain, a towel at the bottom of a door, tape over a charger light, moving a clock out of sight, turning the phone screen down, then better yet, away. Choosing a warmer, dimmer path through the final hour before bed. Keeping midnight bathroom trips gentle on the eyes rather than flooding the room with bright overhead light. These are humble acts. But biology often responds best to humble acts. The body is not impressed by complexity. It is impressed by consistency and signal quality. There is one more thing artificial light does to the sleeping brain, and it is perhaps the easiest to miss. It changes the emotional atmosphere of the night. Darkness is not only a circadian signal, it is also a psychological container. It tells the mind that the world is receding, narrowing, asking less. Brightness extends the social and cognitive world. It says there is still more to notice, more to respond to, more to do. A lit screen means information. A bright room means activity. A television means narrative. Even if you are lying still, the psychological flavor of the environment remains slightly more wake-like. This is why dimness itself can feel calming before sleep, even before actual sleepiness arrives. Dimness reduces demand. It simplifies the world. It lets the mind stop scanning so hard. It is not just that melatonin rises. It is also that the room begins to ask less of you. Artificial light, especially when bright or changing, can do the opposite. It can keep the room in a state of subtle demand. And so the deeper truth is this: artificial light does not merely make the bedroom brighter. It changes what the brain believes about the night. It delays the rise of nighttime certainty. It keeps the sleeping brain slightly more watchful. It can fragment sleep without always waking you. It can reduce how fully restored you feel by morning. It can turn a night that should have been deep and simple into a night the body must quietly work around. Not always, not dramatically every time, but often enough to matter. That is why darkness has so much value. Not because it is mystical, not because it is fashionable, but because the sleeping brain is still a living, sensing, evaluating organ, and darkness gives it something rare: permission to stop checking. Permission to stop doubting. Permission to believe that night has really come. And when the brain believes that, sleep tends to become more generous. In the next part, that generosity becomes the focus. Because once we understand how artificial light can disturb the sleeping brain, the next question is naturally this: what exactly does darkness help protect? What is it about deeper, more stable sleep that makes darkness so valuable in the first place? That is where we go next. For now, just picture the room around you becoming a little darker, a little quieter, a little less negotiable. No blinking lights arguing with the night. No stray glow insisting that day might still continue. Just a sleeping brain, finally given a believable darkness to trust. Part 6: Why Deep Sleep Prefers Dark Environments. There is a kind of sleep that feels different the next morning. Not just longer. Not simply uninterrupted. Different. You know it when it happens, even if you do not have the words for it. You wake and the body feels as if it has actually been somewhere restful. The mind is not instantly sharp, perhaps, but it is clearer. The heaviness behind the eyes is softer. The emotional weather inside you feels steadier. You do not feel merely unconsciousness in hindsight. You feel restoration. And then there are other nights. Nights that look acceptable on paper. Enough hours. No dramatic insomnia. No long waking stretch you can remember. And yet the morning feels thin. Sleep happened, technically. But it did not seem to reach all the way down. That difference matters. Because sleep is not one single state. It is a layered landscape. There are lighter phases, dream-rich phases, transitional phases, and then there is deep sleep, the phase people often speak about with a certain longing, even if they do not always realize that is what they mean. Deep sleep is the kind of sleep that feels less like drifting and more like sinking, less like hovering and more like arriving. It is the part of the night most closely associated with profound physical restoration, with the body dropping into a slower, more protected rhythm. Heart rate lowers. Breathing settles. The brain's electrical activity changes into slow, powerful waves. The whole system seems to move into a state of reduced outward engagement and increased inward work. If lighter sleep is like resting in a quiet room with one ear still turned toward the world, deep sleep is more like descending below the surface of a lake, where the noise above becomes distant and the body can begin its most important maintenance without so much interference. And what darkness does, in one of its most underappreciated roles, is help protect that descent. Not force it exactly. Not guarantee it. But protect it. Because deep sleep, perhaps more than any other part of the night, prefers an environment that is convincing. An environment that says, clearly and without contradiction, that the world outside is no longer asking much of you. The room is dark. The signals are quiet. The nervous system can loosen its grip. The body can stop preparing for interruption and begin leaning into repair. That is what darkness helps create. To understand why, it helps to remember that sleep is never simply the absence of wakefulness. The brain does not fall asleep and vanish. It changes modes. It reorganizes. It cycles. It continues sensing the world, just differently. And in lighter phases of sleep, that sensing can remain fairly responsive. A sound, a change in temperature, a discomfort in the room, or a flicker of light may not fully wake you, but it can alter how the brain moves through the night. Deep sleep, by contrast, is harder won. It is one of the most precious states the body reaches because it requires a certain surrender of vigilance, not total vulnerability. The brain never becomes foolishly unaware, but it does need enough safety, enough continuity, enough confidence in the environment to allow itself to drop into that slower, deeper rhythm. Darkness helps communicate that safety. Not emotional safety in a poetic sense, though it may feel that way too. Biological safety. Environmental consistency. The absence of signals that resemble daytime or alertness or interruption. When darkness is stable, the nervous system has fewer reasons to keep testing the world. Fewer reasons to stay half-ready. And that matters because deep sleep is fragile in a way people often underestimate. Not fragile in the sense that it disappears easily forever. Human beings can still get some deep sleep in imperfect conditions. The body fights for it. It values it. If you are very sleep-deprived, the brain will often try hard to reclaim it. But deep sleep is still influenced by the quality of the environment. It thrives when the night around it feels settled, continuous, and believable. Darkness is part of that believability. It says, in effect, there is no need to stay too close to the surface. You can go deeper now. And going deeper matters because some of the body's most important nighttime work is associated with these deeper phases. Growth hormone release is tied closely to early night deep sleep. Physical restoration, tissue repair, energy regulation, immune support, and certain forms of cellular housekeeping all benefit from this state. The brain, too, seems to use deep sleep for forms of recalibration that lighter sleep does not accomplish in the same way. It is sometimes helpful to imagine the night as having two broad kinds of labor. One is emotional and cognitive, often linked more closely with dream-rich sleep later in the night, where memories and feelings may be integrated and reorganized in subtle ways. The other is more foundational and physical, often linked strongly to deep sleep, where the body seems to step back from the demands of the day and say, quietly, now we repair. That second kind of labor prefers darkness. Again, not because darkness is magic, but because darkness supports the conditions under which the brain is more willing to maintain a deep state. Artificial light, even if it does not wake you, can act like a gentle tug upward, a reminder to the nervous system that the world may still require monitoring. A little less certainty, a little less surrender, a little more surface. The difference between surface and depth is everything here. Think of the ocean on a windy day. Near the top, there is movement, chop, constant interaction with weather. But deeper down, the water becomes more stable, more insulated from the immediate noise above. Deep sleep is like that lower layer. It is not perfectly detached from the world, but it is less buffeted by it. Darkness helps the brain get there. And when darkness is interrupted, the brain may spend more of the night nearer the surface than it otherwise would. This is one reason so many people feel they sleep, but do not feel deeply slept. They may have had enough total time in bed. They may not remember long awakenings. But the night itself may have been too fragmented, too bright, too inconsistent, or too physiologically shallow to allow enough genuine depth. Shallow nights can still fill the hours. They just do not fill the person the same way. This is where the modern bedroom becomes surprisingly important. We often treat the bedroom as a place that begins mattering only once consciousness fades. But in reality, it is more like a nest for nervous system signals. The body does not only respond to the mattress or the blanket. It responds to temperature, noise, air, light, and timing. All of these become part of the conversation about how deeply the system is willing to rest. Darkness is one of the strongest parts of that conversation because it does not merely remove visual stimulation. It shapes the physiological meaning of the room. A dim room says evening. A dark room says night. A truly dark room, once the body has already received a decent rhythm of day and evening light, says something even more valuable. It says continuity. It says the transition is complete. It says there is no need to keep checking whether the chapter has changed. That continuity is deeply useful for deep sleep because the early part of the night, when deep sleep is often most concentrated, is also when the brain is making one of its largest downward transitions. If the environment keeps reintroducing brightness, or the residues of daytime light, the descent can become less smooth. Imagine trying to walk down a staircase into a quiet cellar while someone occasionally opens the door upstairs and floods the stairwell with bright light. You may still reach the bottom, but the movement becomes more hesitant. Your body remains more aware of the upper world than it needs to be. Artificial light at night can create that kind of hesitation in biological terms. And hesitation is the enemy of depth. There is also something deeply old about this preference. For nearly all of human history, deep sleep would have taken place in darkness that was, by modern standards, much more complete. Night was not simply less bright. It was categorically different. Day and night were not blended by screens, hallways, kitchen lights, and city glow. The visual world made a clean argument. That argument shaped the nervous system over a very long span of time. We are living, quite literally, inside a biology that expects stronger contrast than modern life usually provides. Which means many people are not failing at sleep. They are sleeping in diluted night. That phrase is useful. Diluted night. Not total wakefulness. Not disaster. Just night weakened by intrusion. Night thinned by unnecessary brightness. Night made less persuasive than the body would prefer. And when night is diluted, deep sleep often becomes one of the first things to lose some of its richness. This may also explain why darkness can feel more emotionally meaningful than its simple physical description suggests. People often say they sleep better in hotel rooms with blackout curtains, in rural places far from city glow, in cabins, or in bedrooms that somehow feel more cocooned. Temperature may help. Noise may help. Novelty may even help in some cases. But darkness itself is often one of the hidden reasons those environments feel restorative. A dark room does not keep asking the brain to orient outward. It allows inwardness. It allows the body to shift resources away from checking the environment and toward using the night. That phrase matters too. Using the night. Because deep sleep is not passive. The body is not doing nothing in that state. It is doing some of its most important work, and that work requires the right conditions to flourish. It is as if darkness clears the stage so more essential processes can step forward. One of the most fascinating examples of this is the brain's own cleaning and maintenance rhythms. While the details are still being refined by ongoing research, deep sleep appears to be especially associated with states in which the brain can more effectively regulate waste clearance, reset neural activity, and recover from the high information burden of waking life. We spend the day sensing, deciding, reacting, learning, and emotionally interpreting. The waking brain is metabolically expensive. Night is not merely the pause after that expense. It is part of the cost recovery process. Deep sleep seems to be one of the times when that recovery is especially meaningful. And darkness, by supporting the stability of the night, helps protect the conditions under which that recovery can happen more fully. The same is true for the body more broadly. Muscles repair. Tissues recover. Energy systems rebalance. The immune system continues its quiet surveillance and maintenance. None of these processes belongs to deep sleep alone, but deep sleep forms one of the strongest containers for them. It is one of the body's most protected hours, even when we are not conscious enough to appreciate what is happening, which is why it is worth appreciating now. Because when we think carelessly about sleep, we tend to imagine it as dead time, a blank interval between the real parts of life. But deep sleep is one of the least blank things the body ever does. It is one of the most productive kinds of stillness in the biological world. The body looks quiet from the outside, yet inside it is profoundly engaged in restoration. Darkness helps preserve that productivity by reducing contradiction. And contradiction matters so much because the sleeping brain is always balancing two impulses. One impulse is to descend and restore. The other is to remain available enough to detect anything important in the environment. In a truly dark, quiet, safe-feeling setting, the second impulse can soften. The first can dominate more fully. But when light persists or reappears, the balancing act shifts. The environment does not feel as decisively night. The system remains a little more available to disruption. This does not always mean awakening. Often it means shallower depth, less continuity, less complete disengagement from the possibility of response. That is why darkness is not only about falling asleep faster. It is about giving the night enough integrity for deeper sleep to remain protected after sleep begins. That is a different and often more important goal. People sometimes focus all their attention on sleep onset, the drama of whether they can fall asleep at all. That is understandable. Difficulty falling asleep is frustrating and emotionally visible. But some of the most meaningful benefits of darkness come later, when consciousness is already gone and the body is trying to move through deeper phases without being pulled upward unnecessarily. In other words, darkness is not only the invitation to sleep, it is the guard at the door of sleep's deepest rooms. And those deepest rooms matter immensely for how the next day feels. You can see the results in simple, everyday terms. After a night with richer deep sleep, many people find themselves a little more emotionally buffered. Annoyances land less sharply. Mental effort feels slightly less costly. The body has a kind of groundedness that is hard to fake. You are not invincible. You are simply more restored. After a poorer, shallower night, the opposite often happens. Patience thins. Cravings rise. Focus fractures more easily. The world feels slightly more abrasive. Again, this is why deep sleep matters. It is not an abstract sleep science concept. It is part of the foundation beneath mood, cognition, resilience, and physical well-being. Darkness, by helping protect deep sleep, becomes one of the quiet allies of next-day stability. And the beauty of that is how simple it is. Not easy, always. but simple. A darker room, a dimmer evening, fewer lit devices, less screen light late, more respect for the body's need for convincing night. None of these is glamorous. None sounds like a breakthrough in the way modern culture likes breakthroughs to sound. But biology often does its best work when given plain, old-fashioned conditions it already understands. Darkness is one of those conditions. If this slower kind of science is helping you unwind a little, you can always subscribe or leave a like. And if you ever notice that some places seem to give you a more satisfying kind of sleep than others, it is often worth asking whether the darkness there feels different too. There is another subtle reason deep sleep prefers dark environments, and it has to do with trust. Not emotional trust exactly, though it overlaps. Biological trust. The body learns from repeated environments. A bedroom that is consistently dark, cool, and quiet becomes easier for the nervous system to associate with genuine night. The body begins preparing sooner, descending more smoothly, and resisting less. That kind of conditioning is powerful. Over time, the room itself begins to feel like part of the circadian signal. This is why some people feel sleepy almost as soon as they enter a well-kept bedroom at night. The place has become legible to the nervous system. The body knows what it means. Deep sleep benefits from that kind of legibility because uncertainty and ambiguity require more monitoring. Familiar darkness requires less. And yet there is no need to become rigid about it. The goal is not perfection. Perfection is bright and stressful in its own way. The goal is simply to make the night more believable, more consistent, more aligned with what the brain has always used as evidence that it can finally loosen its grip on the day. When that happens, deep sleep becomes less like something you chase and more like something the body is allowed to enter. That is a gentler and more honest framing. You do not manufacture deep sleep directly. You create the conditions that stop interfering with it. You make the room darker. You let evening become evening. You stop arguing with night. And the body, if given enough rhythm and enough darkness, often remembers what to do. This leads naturally to a larger and quieter truth. Darkness is not an inconvenience to overcome. It is part of the architecture of restoration. We tend to think of modern life as an escape from darkness, as if darkness were only a primitive limitation and light were pure progress. But biology tells a more balanced story. Yes, light extended our days and changed civilization. But darkness still performs work light cannot do. It is not just what is left when the switch goes off. It is part of the condition under which deep repair becomes possible. That makes darkness less like emptiness and more like a resource. A resource the sleeping brain knows how to use. And once you begin to see it that way, the question of sleep changes. It stops being only, how many hours did I get? And becomes, how convincing was the night my body was given? Sometimes that question matters more. As we move forward, the story widens again. Because sleep is not just personal biology in the present moment. It is also inheritance, evolution, the long memory of a species shaped under skies that became truly dark. To understand fully why our brains and bodies still crave that darkness, we have to look backward. We have to remember the kind of nights human beings once lived under, and how those nights trained the nervous system long before electricity ever arrived. That is where we go next. For now, just let this settle in the quiet. The deepest sleep is not simply unconsciousness. It is trust, depth, and repair. And darkness, when allowed to be real, helps make all three possible. Part 7. The evolutionary story of why humans need darkness. Long before there were bedrooms, there was night. Not the night we know now, softened by traffic lights, phone screens, hallway bulbs, glowing appliances, and the faint orange haze of distant cities. A much older night. A darker night. A night that arrived not as a lifestyle choice or an inconvenience, but as one of the most stable forces in human existence. It is difficult to fully imagine now. To modern eyes, darkness often feels incomplete unless it is extreme, like a cave, a remote desert, a mountaintop, or a power outage that suddenly reminds us how much brightness usually surrounds us. For many people, even night is still threaded with artificial glow. The world hums. The edges of things remain visible. There is almost always some sign that civilization is still awake. But for most of human history, night was not diluted. It was convincing. It came with weight. It changed what people could do, how far they could see, how quickly they moved, how they gathered, how they listened, how they rested, and how deeply they felt the difference between the active world of day and the hidden world of darkness. And because the human nervous system was shaped inside that older rhythm for such an unimaginably long time, our brains still carry its expectations. We are modern in our habits, perhaps, but far older in our biology. That is what makes the evolutionary story so important. Because when we ask why the brain needs darkness, we are really asking a larger question. What kind of world shaped the human brain? What conditions did it learn to trust? What patterns repeated themselves so reliably that the body began building entire systems around them? And one of the clearest answers is this. For a very long time, humans lived under bright days and dark nights. That contrast was not optional. It was one of the organizing features of reality. Imagine a world without electricity, without glowing screens, without late-night supermarkets, without floodlit parking lots, without blue-white bathroom bulbs switched on at midnight, without a phone held 6 inches from the face in bed. Imagine a world where sunset actually meant something physical and social. The workday did not merely become less productive. The visible world itself narrowed. The horizon vanished. Distances became uncertain. Colors drained. The body was not simply told by culture that the day was ending. It was shown by the planet. This mattered enormously. Because evolution works through repetition, it favors systems that respond well to the conditions that keep showing up. If light reliably predicts safety, opportunity, movement, food gathering, and social coordination, then organisms that become active in light tend to do better. If darkness reliably predicts a shift in risk, visibility, metabolism, temperature, and opportunity, then organisms that adapt properly to darkness tend to do better too. Humans are no exception. We are not the only creatures whose lives are synchronized to light and dark, of course. Birds rise before dawn. Many insects emerge at dusk. Nocturnal animals have their own remarkable adaptations. Plants open and close with astonishing timing. Even simple organisms with no central brain still follow cycles. Earth rotates, light changes, life responds. But the human case is especially interesting because we became a daytime species with a large, metabolically expensive brain. We evolved to gather information visually, cooperate socially, move through landscapes, use tools, and eventually create fire, shelter, language, and culture. All of that unfolded inside a world where light was precious and darkness was consequential. Day offered range. Night withdrew it. Day expanded possibility. Night narrowed it. And the nervous system learned that those two phases required different strategies. In daylight, the human brain could afford outwardness. Scan the horizon. Read faces. Notice fruit color, water shimmer, animal movement, changes in weather. Coordinate with others. Travel. Hunt. Gather. Build. Teach. Observe. In darkness, much of that became harder. Sight lost power. Distance collapsed. The world became more local, more auditory, more uncertain. A rustle in the dark carried a different emotional charge than movement seen clearly in daylight. Night was not only about sleep, of course. Humans have always used fire, told stories, watched the sky, shared food, guarded one another, and remained active to some extent after sunset. But even then, night did not become day. Firelight extended the social world. It did not erase darkness. And that distinction matters more than we often realize. Because many people imagine the evolutionary story too simply. They think, humans once had no light at night, so darkness must be the natural state. But humans did have light at night. They had flame. They had the moon. They had stars. They had embers and torches and dawn fires and seasonal light variation. What they did not have was unlimited, bright, cool-toned, overhead, all-purpose, every room illumination that could make midnight resemble late afternoon. The difference is not that ancient humans lived in total blackness every evening. The difference is that the light available at night was limited, warm, local, and weak compared to day. It did not fully flatten the contrast between daytime and nighttime. It still allowed the body to understand, very clearly, that it was night. That is what the circadian system evolved to work with. Strong contrast. Reliable sequence. Day comes, then fades. Night arrives, then deepens. Morning returns. The system learned those transitions not just once, but over countless generations. So when we say the body needs darkness, what we really mean is that the body was built inside a world where darkness had a consistent job to do. Darkness was not just absence. It was the environmental phase in which certain forms of restoration, energy conservation, reduced activity, social winding down, and sleep could happen more safely and more predictably. The body did not invent nighttime physiology by accident. It built it because darkness kept returning. And because darkness kept returning, it became worth anticipating. This is one of the most beautiful things about the evolutionary story. The body does not only react to darkness, it prepares for it. It learned, over deep time, that the world would dim, that visibility would fall, that opportunities would change, and that a different internal mode would soon be more adaptive. So it became rhythmic. Temperature shifts, hormone shifts, alertness shifts, sleep pressure, melatonin timing, even changes in digestion and immune behavior, all became tied in some way to the regularity of light and dark. This means the human body is not merely capable of sleep, it is expectant of rhythm, and darkness is one half of that rhythm. There is a common modern fantasy that progress means escaping darkness entirely. We light the streets, light the house, light the office tower, light the screen, light the car dashboard, light the watch face, light the child's room, light the kitchen after midnight, light the hallway so we never have to pause. Light becomes a way of asserting control over time itself. We do not merely illuminate what we need, we extend day. That is an extraordinary achievement in one sense. It made many forms of human life easier, safer, more productive, and more flexible. But evolution is not impressed by convenience alone. Biology still asks whether the signals make sense. And what makes sense to a body shaped over immense stretches of pre-electric time is not endless light, but meaningful contrast. Bright active days, dim descending evenings, dark nights long enough to signal that a different biological chapter has begun. That is the world our brains remember, even if only at the level of structure and function rather than conscious memory. In a way, the body carries an ancestral memory of darkness, not memory in the personal sense. No one remembers the Paleolithic. No one remembers the first fires, the long winters, the early camps, the moonlit paths, the fear of predators in the dark, the slow movement of stars over unpolluted skies. But the nervous system was tuned in those worlds. It was tuned under real sunsets and convincing darkness. It was tuned when night still felt like a condition rather than a decorative background. That is why modern nighttime brightness can feel more disruptive than reason alone would predict. The waking mind says, it is just a lamp. The ancient body says, then perhaps the day is not fully over. This is not superstition. It is the inertia of evolution. And inertia is powerful. A species does not redesign its core circadian machinery in a century or two. Electricity is too recent. Screens are too recent. LEDs are even more recent. The body you sleep in tonight is still operating on expectations shaped in a world where the sky was the main clock and darkness still had authority. That means something important. It means your difficulty settling at night is not a personal weakness in many cases. It may be the natural friction between an old biological design and a very new lighting environment. It means your sleepiness did not evolve for late-night scrolling. Your melatonin system did not evolve for kitchen spotlights at 11:30. Your eyes did not evolve for a bright rectangle inches away in the dark. Your body clock did not evolve to parse whether a cool white LED in the corner is harmless background or some small fragment of day. It only knows that there is light. This evolutionary mismatch helps explain why sleep can sometimes feel so stubborn. People often speak about sleep as if it were a matter of discipline or psychology alone. Those matter, certainly. Stress matters. Habit matters. Emotion matters. But beneath all of that sits something much older. The body is still trying to organize itself around cues that were once simpler and more honest. Morning used to look like morning. Evening used to look like evening. Night used to look like night. Now those categories are frequently blurred. And blurred categories produce blurred rhythms. There is another part of the evolutionary story that is easy to miss. Darkness did not only shape sleep. It shaped social life, storytelling, vigilance, intimacy, and thought. Firelight gatherings likely played a role in language, memory, myth, and cooperation. Night may have encouraged slower speech, closer circles, listening instead of scanning, inwardness instead of outward movement. Darkness changes not only physiology, but attention. It narrows the visible world and often deepens the felt one. You can still sense traces of that today. A brightly lit room tends to pull the mind outward. Notice this. Do that. Read that. Respond here. A dim room often does the opposite. It gathers experience inward. Voices soften. Pace slows. Silence feels less empty. Thought becomes more associative, less task-driven. Memories arise differently. Emotions feel nearer to the surface, but often calmer too. This does not happen by magic. Darkness reduces visual demand. It shrinks the field of stimulation. It returns the nervous system, in some small way, to an older mode of being. Not prehistoric exactly, just less saturated. And that older mode may be one of the reasons darkness is so compatible with sleep. It is not simply the absence of activation. It is the presence of an environment in which inwardness becomes easier. That is what many modern evenings are missing. The body receives night on the clock, but not in the room. The hour says 10:30. The lighting says 5 in the afternoon. The phone says keep going. The ceiling light says stay alert. The television says remain socially and emotionally engaged. And the body, caught between signals, hesitates. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. A nervous system shaped in bright day dark night conditions will always struggle a little when both phases are mixed together artificially. It can adapt, but adaptation often comes with cost. Later sleep onset. Lighter sleep. More nighttime wakefulness. Less clear morning energy. A muted day-night contrast. In other words, the body becomes less sure of when to be what. That uncertainty is exhausting over time, and it ripples beyond sleep. Daytime mood, appetite, stress tolerance, energy, and cognitive steadiness all depend in part on the integrity of the rhythm beneath them. A good rhythm does not make life easy, but it gives life a stronger internal structure. A weak rhythm makes everything feel a bit less anchored. This is one reason natural darkness feels so powerful when people re-encounter it. Go somewhere rural. Lose the city glow. Sit outside after sunset with no nearby screen. Watch the sky deepen until objects stop demanding detail. Feel what happens in the nervous system. For many people, there is an almost immediate sense of exhale. Not always sleepiness yet, just exhale. The body seems to understand the scene without needing to be told. The environment makes an argument the biology recognizes. It says, the visible world is receding. You do not need to keep performing wakefulness so intensely. That message is ancient, older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than language in its modern form. The body still knows how to hear it. This may be why people sometimes sleep deeply on camping trips, despite discomforts they would normally think impossible to rest with. Not everyone, of course. Some sleep worse outdoors. Temperature, noise, novelty, and safety perception all matter. But for many, exposure to strong natural light by day and real darkness by night begins restoring a clearer rhythm surprisingly quickly. The body, given back the old contrast, starts remembering its old timing. That does not mean everyone needs to sleep outdoors under the stars. It simply means the body still values the signals those conditions provide. And we can borrow from that understanding even in modern homes. Dimmer evenings. Less overhead brightness late. Fewer stray light sources in the bedroom. Morning light when possible. Night that actually becomes night. These are not nostalgic rituals for people who dislike technology. They are ways of aligning a modern life, imperfectly but meaningfully, with an older biological design. And there is something profoundly gentle in that. It is not about rejecting progress. It is about making peace with inheritance. The body you live in is not a blank slate built for the last 10 years. It is an old design navigating new conditions. Treat it with that kind of respect, and sleep often becomes less adversarial. There is also comfort in realizing that your need for darkness is not fragile or overly sensitive. It is ancient. It is shared. It links you not only to modern sleep science, but to every human being who ever watched a fire burn lower, listened to the night sounds beyond a shelter, noticed the moon on the ground, or felt the body soften as darkness deepened around them. In that sense, darkness is one of the oldest common experiences in human life. We have changed the world around it. We have not changed its meaning inside the nervous system nearly as much. If this slower journey is helping you drift a little deeper into the night, you can always leave a like, subscribe, or simply keep listening. Quiet science has a way of becoming a kind of shelter too. There is one more evolutionary detail worth lingering over. Humans are not nocturnal. That sounds obvious, but it matters. We are day-active creatures with enough flexibility to do some things after dark, not full-night specialists built to flourish in bright artificial midnight. Our eyes, hormones, metabolism, and cognitive rhythms all bear the marks of that design. The fact that we can function under artificial light does not mean we do so without trade-offs. A body can survive misalignment for quite a while. Survival, however, is not the same as harmony. Darkness is part of harmony, not constant darkness, not permanent retreat from light, but night darkness, contextual darkness, darkness at the right time, strong enough to help the brain believe the day is truly over. That is what our ancestors repeatedly had. That is what our bodies repeatedly learned. That is what many modern environments repeatedly weaken. And that is why reclaiming darkness, even a little, can feel so disproportionately helpful. It restores not just a sleep habit, but a missing half of the rhythm we were built for. As this evolutionary story settles in, another practical question naturally begins to rise. If the brain evolved under real darkness, how much darkness does it actually need now? Does the room have to be perfectly black? Is dim light enough? Is moonlight okay? Is a faint hallway glow harmless? Where is the boundary between natural night and biologically confusing night? That is what we explore next. For now, just let the older world return for a moment in your mind. A fire burning low. The sky gone dark enough for stars to matter. The visible world reduced to outlines and nearby faces. The body no longer asked to stay outward and productive, but invited inward by the simple honesty of night. Your brain was shaped there. And somewhere beneath the modern noise, it still knows that darkness means it is finally time to let go. Part 8: Absolute darkness versus dim light. At this point, a very practical question begins to rise. If darkness matters so much, then how dark is dark enough? Does the brain need absolute, total, cave-like blackness every night? The kind of darkness where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face? Or is soft dimness enough? Is moonlight a problem? What about a nightlight in the hallway, a street lamp slipping through the curtain, or the faint glow of a clock across the room? This is where the conversation becomes especially interesting, because it moves us away from dramatic slogans and into something gentler and much more useful. The body does not live by slogans. It lives by signals. And the truth is that not all darkness is equal, just as not all light is equal. A candle is not a phone screen. Moonlight is not an LED. A dim amber lamp in the corner is not the same thing as bright overhead kitchen light at midnight. A room that is softly darkened is not identical to a room flooded by city glow. And yet, from the point of view of the nervous system, all of these belong to the same larger question: how convincing is the night? That may be the most important question in this entire topic. Not, is there any light at all? Not, have I achieved laboratory-grade blackness? But, how convincing is the night my brain is being given? Because the body is not just measuring brightness in a crude way. It is reading context, timing, contrast, pattern, direction. It is always asking, at some level, whether the environment resembles real night closely enough for nighttime physiology to fully commit itself. And commitment is what matters here. You can think of it this way. The body does not need a theatrical, exaggerated darkness to understand that night has begun. Human beings have always slept with natural variation. Some nights were lit by a bright moon, some by stars, some by clouds hiding everything, some near a fire, some in huts or tents or cabins with small cracks that let in faint morning light. The body is adaptable. It was never designed only for a laboratory box sealed from every photon, but it was designed for nighttime conditions that remained recognizably different from day. That is the key. The problem with much modern light is not simply that it exists. The problem is that it often weakens the contrast between day and night too much, and too late. It confuses the story. It makes the room feel less decisively like night and more like a diluted extension of daytime. And diluted night often produces diluted signaling. That means the question is not really whether absolute darkness is the only acceptable goal. The better question is whether the brain is receiving a strong enough, clear enough message that darkness has truly arrived and is being protected. In many cases, the answer to that question depends on both the kind of light and the amount of light. Natural dim light and artificial dim light are not always interpreted the same way by the body, not because the brain is sentimental, but because their qualities differ. Moonlight, for example, is dim and environmentally coherent. It belongs to the nighttime world. It comes from the sky, changes gradually, and is usually nowhere near as visually dominant as a close screen or bright indoor bulb. Firelight, too, while certainly light, has a different rhythm and spectral character than modern cool-toned electric light. It flickers. It stays local. It does not usually saturate entire rooms with broad, even brightness. Modern artificial light often behaves very differently. It is stable, strong, and indifferent to hour. It can illuminate the room as if the sun had not fully left. It can sit close to the face. It can arrive suddenly. It can remain on at full strength right up until sleep. It can turn a biologically meaningful dusk into something like permanent late afternoon. That is where the trouble often begins. So, does the brain need absolute darkness? Not always in the strictest imaginable sense, but it often benefits from as much real darkness as is practical, especially during sleep, because darker environments reduce contradiction and support a clearer night signal. That is the practical answer. The more useful you make darkness, the less the brain has to argue with the room. Still, this question deserves more nuance, because people often swing too far in one direction or the other. Some become casual and say, a little light can't matter at all. Others become anxious and think, if there is any light anywhere, my sleep is ruined. Neither extreme is especially helpful. Biology is rarely that theatrical. The nervous system is responsive, but it is also tolerant within a range. The issue is often not a single tiny imperfection. The issue is the cumulative environment. A room with slight natural dimness and otherwise good night signaling is one thing. A room with street light through the curtains, a digital clock, a charger light, a TV indicator, a nearby phone screen, and one more trip to a bright bathroom is another. The body experiences patterns, not isolated legal violations. This is why the phrase, absolute darkness versus dim light, can be slightly misleading if treated too rigidly. The more realistic comparison is often, convincing night versus compromised night. A room can have a trace of harmless dimness and still feel like convincing night. A room can also seem, not that bright, to the conscious mind and yet still be compromised enough to blur the brain's nighttime confidence. What matters is the overall message. One of the simplest ways to understand this is to think about adaptation. In a truly dim room, your eyes adapt. Small glows begin to look larger than they would by day. A charger light across the room may seem trivial at noon and strangely sharp at 2 in the morning. A little light under the door can look brighter once your visual system has adapted to darkness. The brain reads that contrast. So while a person may insist that the room is basically dark, the nervous system may still be dealing with a few biologically loud interruptions. And loud is the right word again. Brightness is relative. A light source does not have to be enormous to be loud in a dark adapted environment. This is one reason phone checks during the night can feel so disruptive. The person may wake briefly, glance at the time, and think it was only a second. But the screen is extremely bright relative to the darkness around it, extremely close to the eyes, and delivered at exactly the wrong time biologically. The issue is not only brightness in an abstract sense. It is brightness plus timing plus proximity plus contrast. That combination matters. A dim, indirect hallway glow behind a closed bedroom door is not in the same category as a bright screen in the face. A faint moonlit outline through curtains is not in the same category as turning on a ceiling light. A warm bedside lamp used gently for a few quiet minutes is not in the same category as overhead white light flooding the room while you scroll through messages. This is why context is everything. The body is always asking something like this. How bright is it? How late is it? How long is this lasting? How direct is it? How different is this from the rest of the room? How consistent has the night been so far? That means a perfect answer does not exist for every person in every room. Some people are more sensitive. Some bedrooms are more light polluted. Some cities never get truly dark. Some people already have strong daytime light exposure and reasonably dim evenings, which can make the system more resilient. Others live almost entirely indoors under artificial light, in which case nighttime light may have a stronger blurring effect because the contrast across the whole day is already weak. That broader contrast matters tremendously. A body that gets strong, bright, real morning and daytime light often builds a clearer circadian rhythm than a body that spends the whole day in dim indoor conditions and then floods itself with brightness late at night. In the first case, even if the bedroom is not perfectly black, the brain may still have a clearer sense of what phase of the day it is in. In the second case, the body may feel as if it lives in permanent visual ambiguity. Day is not bright enough. Night is not dark enough. Everything becomes a kind of endless twilight. And endless twilight is not what the nervous system evolved for. That may be the deeper reason absolute darkness sounds so appealing to people once they start learning about sleep. It represents certainty. It represents the complete opposite of endless twilight. But again, certainty is the actual prize, not purity for its own sake. A very dark room is often the simplest way to create certainty. That is why blackout curtains can be so effective. Not because the body is demanding theatrical blackness as a luxury, but because they remove one of the most common modern contradictions: outside light entering the room long after the body has tried to begin night. The same logic applies to covering device LEDs, turning clocks away, dimming the route to the bathroom, or reducing bright light in the hour before bed. Each small choice increases the clarity of the message. Night is happening. Night is continuing. You do not need to keep checking. That last part may be one of the most valuable. The nervous system loves not having to keep checking. Deep rest begins when the brain no longer feels compelled to ask whether the world has changed. There is also a more emotional side to this question, though it rests on biology. Some people are uncomfortable in total darkness. That matters. A bedroom should not feel threatening. If pitch blackness makes someone tense, on edge, or unable to relax, then perfect darkness may paradoxically make sleep worse for that person, at least for a while. The body cares about perceived safety too. A nervous system that feels deeply uneasy will not rest simply because the room meets an abstract darkness standard. So in those cases, the best approach is usually not punishment or forced austerity. It is a gradual reduction of unnecessary light while preserving enough comfort that the room still feels secure. Sometimes that means warm, very dim, indirect light outside the sleeping area rather than direct visible brightness near the bed. Sometimes it means working first on late evening screens and overhead light before obsessing over a faint distant glow. Sometimes it means blackout curtains plus a soft routine that makes darkness feel predictable instead of alarming. Sleep works best with kindness, not with fear. That is worth saying clearly. The goal is not to become stressed about sleep science. The goal is to make the night easier for the body to believe. In many cases, dim light can be enough to support a good transition if it is handled well. Dim, warm, low light in the last part of the evening can be much gentler on the nervous system than bright, cool, overhead light. It can preserve some social comfort and visibility while still allowing the body to begin shifting into nighttime mode. This is one reason people often find lamps, candles, or warmer pockets of evening light so calming. They feel less like daytime continuation and more like a visual bridge into night. That bridge matters. You do not always go from fully awake to asleep all at once. You descend. Or at least, the body prefers to descend. A harshly lit environment interrupts descent. A softly dimmed environment supports it. Then once sleep begins, darker conditions help protect the depth of that sleep. This is often the most sensible model. Dimness for transition, darkness for protection. The evening does not have to begin in a blacked-out cave. But by the time sleep is underway, the closer the room is to real darkness, the less contradiction the sleeping brain must work around. Moonlight often raises people's curiosity here. After all, humans have always slept under the moon. Does that mean moonlight is harmless? In a practical sense, moonlight is usually far less disruptive than modern indoor light because it is dimmer and much less direct, though of course a very bright full moon through an uncovered window can still affect a room. But again, the principle is contrast and dominance. A little ambient moon glow is not the same as a room half lit by a television or city-facing window. The body evolved with celestial light. It did not evolve with a phone screen or constant electric brightness at midnight. That distinction may sound romantic, but it is mostly about scale and timing. Starlight and moonlight tell a nighttime story. Most artificial light tells a daytime story, even when used at night. This is why people often sleep better after evenings spent under dim outdoor light or firelight than after evenings spent under bright screens and overhead lamps, even if both settings technically included light. The body is reading a much deeper language than the waking mind usually notices. There is also the matter of intermittency. A room that is dim and stable may be less disruptive than a room that keeps flashing, brightening, or changing unpredictably. A stable low-level glow is one kind of message. A screen turning on, a motion light outside, a television flicker, or repeated notification flashes are another. The nervous system is especially attentive to change. Sudden change invites reassessment. Reassessment is closer to wakefulness than to deep rest. This is another reason absolute darkness can be helpful. It eliminates change. No intermittent cues. No glow to notice more sharply after an eye opens for a moment. No little argument with the room. And if the room cannot be made perfectly dark, then reducing change becomes just as important. Cover the blinking light. Silence the phone. Turn screens away. Stop the little visual surprises that ask the brain to orient itself again. You can think of all this as reducing the visual workload of the night. The less the brain has to interpret, the more completely it can yield. There is something beautifully simple in that. We spend so much of the day interpreting, reading, sorting, responding, deciding. Night offers one of the rare chances for the visual world to stop making demands. Darkness is valuable partly because it removes choice. There is nothing to evaluate, nothing to compare, nothing to chase with the eyes. The body can withdraw. Dim light can imitate some of that, but only if it remains gentle enough not to invite renewed wakefulness. That is why dim is not one single thing. Some dim rooms are truly restful. Others are just weak daytime. A bedside lamp aimed low with a warm bulb is one thing. A bright ceiling fixture on a dimmer but still flooding the whole room is another. A red-orange reading light for a few minutes is one thing. A cool white laptop in a dark room is another. The body knows the difference, even if the person casually labels all of them kind of dim. By now, you may notice that the answer keeps returning to a similar shape. More darkness is usually better than less, especially during sleep. But the most useful practical target is not perfection for its own sake. It is a nighttime environment that feels unmistakably like night to the nervous system. That means as dark as reasonably possible while still feeling comfortable and safe. That means reducing biologically loud light sources even if they seem visually small. That means respecting timing, because the same light that is almost meaningless at noon can become much more significant at midnight. That means understanding that dim, warm, low, stable light is generally far gentler than bright, cool, close, changing light. And that means remembering that the body responds to patterns more than isolated moments. A life with bright days, dim evenings, and dark sleeping conditions is different from a life lived in weak daytime light and blurry nighttime brightness, even if both include the same number of hours in bed. If this quiet kind of science is helping you soften into the evening a little, you can always leave a like or subscribe. And if you've ever changed something small in your room and been surprised by how much better the night felt, that is often where sleep wisdom begins. There is one final thought here that feels worth holding on to. Absolute darkness is not a moral badge. It is not something to be proud of in a rigid way. It is simply one of the clearest ways to give the brain a strong night signal. Dim light, used wisely, can still support the transition into sleep, especially before bed. But the closer your actual sleeping environment gets to believable darkness, the more you remove the need for the brain to negotiate with the possibility of day. And negotiation is tiring. The body rests best when it no longer needs to negotiate. That may be the simplest answer of all. In the next part, we move from the environment of sleep into something even more intimate, what darkness may support inside the sleeping brain itself. Because once the night is dark enough and stable enough, the brain does more than just rest. It dreams. It sorts memory. It regulates emotion. It participates in a kind of overnight recovery that most of us only notice indirectly the next day. That is where we go next. For now, just let the room in your mind grow a little dimmer. Not dramatic. Not frightening. Just clear. Clear enough that the body no longer has to wonder what phase of the world it is in. Clear enough that the eyes stop asking questions. Clear enough that the brain, finally convinced, can stop reading the room and begin using the night. Part 9: Darkness, Dreams, Memory, and Brain Recovery. It is easy to think of sleep as empty time, a gap in consciousness, a blank corridor between one day and the next. You close your eyes, the world disappears, and then somehow morning arrives. If you slept badly, you feel it. If you slept well, you feel that too. But what happened in between often seems hidden, almost inaccessible, as if the whole night were just a dark stretch of nothing. But the sleeping brain is not doing nothing. Far from it. In some ways, the brain at night is more interesting than the brain by day, because it is no longer spending so much of its energy dealing with the outer world. It is not answering emails, scanning rooms, making social judgments, reacting to traffic, solving work problems, or holding itself upright inside the constant bright pressure of modern life. Instead, it turns inward. And once it turns inward, a great deal begins to happen. Memories are sorted. Emotion is softened and reorganized. The body continues repairing. The brain cycles through different phases of sleep with different jobs. Dreams emerge, not as random nonsense in every case, but often as strange, fluid expressions of a mind still working with the materials of life. And all of this unfolds most gracefully when the night around the brain is stable, convincing, and dark enough to support it. That last part matters. Because darkness is not the same thing as sleep itself. Darkness does not force a dream into existence, and it does not single-handedly create memory or repair. But darkness protects the conditions under which these nighttime processes can unfold with less interruption and less contradiction. It helps the night remain a night, and the brain needs that. By now, you can probably feel the pattern repeating. Light tells the brain what kind of phase the world is in. Darkness confirms that the active visible world is receding. Melatonin rises. The body clock settles more fully into biological night. Deep sleep becomes easier to protect. And once sleep has real continuity, the brain can begin moving through the more subtle and complex work of the night. This is where dreams enter the story. Dreams are such a familiar part of human life that we often stop noticing how strange they really are. Every night, the brain slips into states where memory, sensation, emotion, and imagination begin to mix in ways that waking logic would never allow. The dead may speak. Childhood homes may blend with airports. A single sentence may feel overwhelmingly important. A face may belong to two people at once. Time collapses. Identity stretches. Meaning becomes fluid. And yet when we wake, especially after a night of good sleep, many of those dream fragments vanish quickly, leaving behind only an impression, a feeling, a few vivid images, sometimes nothing at all. This has led many people to imagine dreams as either mystical messages or meaningless leftovers. In truth, they appear to be something more biologically grounded and more interesting than either extreme suggests. Dreaming, especially during REM sleep, seems to be linked with processes by which the brain revisits experience, integrates emotion, and reshapes memory in ways waking consciousness does not. Not with perfect symbolism, not with neat one-to-one interpretation, but with the mind's own nighttime language, which is looser, stranger, more associative, and often more emotionally honest than daytime thinking. If waking thought is linear and task-oriented, dream thought is more like weather moving through memory. And darkness helps protect the night in which that weather can form. To understand why this matters, it helps to step back and see the larger structure. Sleep is not one uniform block. It moves in cycles, typically passing through lighter sleep, deeper sleep, and REM sleep across the night, again and again, with the balance changing as the hours pass. Earlier parts of the night often contain more deep sleep. Later parts tend to include more REM-rich sleep. That does not mean the phases are completely separate or rigid, but it does mean the architecture of the night has a kind of order. The brain is not simply resting in one way for 8 hours. It is moving through an intelligent sequence. And if that sequence is fragmented, shortened, or made shallower by environmental disruption, the brain may still sleep, but some of its nighttime work becomes less complete. This is one reason darkness matters for dreams and memory just as much as it matters for deep sleep. A night that is repeatedly nudged, brightened, interrupted, or diluted may not fully destroy REM sleep or emotional processing, but it can chip away at their continuity. And continuity is often what allows the sleeping brain to do its best work. Think of it like this. If the brain is an editor by day, at night it becomes something like an archivist, a cleaner, and a storyteller all at once. During the day, your mind absorbs far more than you realize. A conversation you barely noticed, the expression on someone's face, the tension in your own body during a meeting, the route you drove, the line you read and forgot, the worry you pushed aside, the music in a shop, the unfinished thought before sleep, the emotional tone of an argument, the tiny moment of relief after it ended. All of that leaves traces. Some traces matter greatly, some do not, and the brain must sort them. It cannot keep everything equally bright forever. It must decide what to strengthen, what to weaken, what to integrate with older knowledge, what to file more deeply, and what to gradually let fade. Sleep appears to be one of the main times when this sorting becomes possible. That is why sleep is so deeply tied to memory. Not memory in the simple sense of, I can remember where I left my keys, though it affects that too. More in the deeper sense that sleep helps decide which parts of your experience become part of you, which fragments remain fleeting and which become woven into longer threads of knowledge, identity, habit, and emotional meaning. A person who sleeps poorly for many nights often notices this. Focus slips. Recall becomes less crisp. Learning feels more effortful. The mind feels cluttered, as if yesterday never got properly put away before today began. That feeling is not imaginary. The brain genuinely seems to rely on sleep to consolidate and organize what waking life throws at it. And because darkness supports the continuity and quality of sleep, darkness indirectly supports that whole process. In other words, darkness is not only about getting sleepy. It is also about giving the brain a better nighttime workshop. There is something especially beautiful about the way memory seems to change across sleep. Many researchers believe that the sleeping brain replays patterns of activity associated with waking experience, strengthening some and reshaping others. A skill practiced in the day may become more stable after sleep. A fact learned before bed may become easier to retrieve the next day. But emotional memories may also be transformed. Sleep does not only help you remember, it may help you remember differently. That last part matters enormously, because life is not only made of facts, it is made of emotional residue. Embarrassment, fear, grief, affection, tension, relief, disappointment, longing, joy. A healthy brain cannot remain equally raw about everything it experiences. It must preserve learning without preserving all the original stain. It must somehow retain the lesson while softening the wound. This is where REM sleep becomes especially fascinating. REM has often been described as a state in which the brain reactivates emotional and experiential material in a neurochemical environment different from waking stress. That means the brain may be revisiting certain kinds of memories while less soaked in the full intensity of stress chemistry that accompanied them originally. The result, over time, may be a kind of overnight emotional processing, not erasure, not instant healing, but adjustment. A memory may remain, yet feel slightly less sharp. A painful event may still matter, yet hurt differently after sleep. A difficult conversation may still be remembered, but the next morning it may no longer feel quite as jagged. Most people know this from experience even if they do not phrase it scientifically. Things often look different after a good night's sleep, not because problems vanish, but because the nervous system has had time to metabolize them. The brain has spent hours doing something subtle and invaluable. It has been reducing the emotional static enough for thought to become usable again. And that process, too, prefers a stable night. It prefers enough darkness for the body to trust the night, enough continuity for sleep cycles to unfold, and enough protection from unnecessary light that the brain does not keep getting tugged back toward the surface. This may be one reason poor sleep and emotional fragility are so closely linked. When sleep is shortened, fragmented, or repeatedly compromised, the mind often becomes more reactive. Small stresses land harder. Patience thins. Negative thoughts stick more easily. The day feels emotionally louder. It is not just that you are tired. It is that the brain has had less chance to do its quiet overnight smoothing. And darkness is part of the protection around that smoothing. Another fascinating aspect of brain recovery at night is physical housekeeping. The brain is an extraordinarily active organ. Even at rest, it consumes a great deal of energy. During the day, it is constantly processing input, maintaining attention, coordinating movement, updating predictions, regulating emotion, and constructing a coherent reality out of floods of sensation. All of that metabolic work leaves behind byproducts that need clearing. Sleep, especially deeper and more stable sleep, appears to support this maintenance in ways waking life does not. People sometimes imagine recovery as something muscles do after exercise. But the brain needs recovery too. It needs periods in which activity patterns change, demands drop, and maintenance can take priority over constant performance. This is another quiet gift of darkness. Darkness tells the system it no longer needs to perform wakefulness so aggressively. The visible world is no longer demanding constant orientation. The day's flood of information has ended. The brain can shift from collecting to processing, from reacting to restoring. That is why nights of truly good sleep can feel so different from mere unconsciousness. The body is not just absent from life. It is using the absence of outward demand to do inward work. There is a simple way to feel the truth of this. Think of the mornings after poor sleep. Even when you technically got hours in bed, the mind may feel cluttered, emotionally unfinished, less buffered, more easily overwhelmed. Now think of the rare mornings after sleep that felt deep, dark, and complete. The mind may still be human, still imperfect, still carrying the same life, but it often feels more arranged inside itself, more swept, more quietly ready. That is recovery. And recovery is not produced by time alone. It is produced by quality, by depth, by continuity, by enough protected darkness that the night can become a real biological event rather than a partial imitation of one. There is also something deeply comforting in the relationship between darkness and dreams. Not because darkness causes more dreams in some simplistic sense, but because darkness helps create the conditions under which the full architecture of sleep can unfold, and dreams are part of that architecture. A brain that can move naturally through deep sleep into REM and onward through multiple cycles is a brain being given the full vocabulary of the night. A fragmented night, by contrast, is like a sentence interrupted over and over again. The meaning may still come through, but less gracefully, less coherently. This is why late light, bedroom light pollution, and midnight screen exposure matter even beyond sleep onset. They are not just obstacles to falling asleep. They are interruptions to the deeper conversation the sleeping brain is trying to have with itself. Dreams are part of that conversation. Memory is part of it. Emotional integration is part of it. Physical and neural restoration are part of it. And darkness, again and again, acts like the quiet around the conversation. It does not speak the words, but it makes them possible. If you think about it, this makes darkness something much richer than absence. Darkness is a container, a condition in which the brain no longer has to keep privileging external information over internal work. In waking life, the world outside usually wins. The eyes must open. The traffic matters. The message matters. The face in front of you matters. The schedule matters. But at night, in convincing darkness, the hierarchy changes. The outer world becomes less urgent. The inner world is finally allowed to take the stage. That is when dreams begin to matter. That is when memory can be revised, stabilized, and integrated. That is when the emotional tone of the day can be metabolized into something softer and more usable. And that is when recovery becomes more than just rest. It becomes reorganization. This may also explain why certain kinds of chronic poor sleep feel so psychologically corrosive. It is not simply sleepiness. It is the repeated loss of a process by which the brain normally repairs emotional friction and integrates daily life. When that process is thinned night after night, people often feel not just tired, but internally unfinished. Their experience accumulates faster than it is being processed. Their emotions become less buffered, their memory less crisp, their sense of self more scattered. A dark, protected night does not solve every problem in a person's life, of course, but it gives the brain back one of its oldest tools for coping with being human. That matters more than we often admit, and it is why darkness can sometimes feel healing in ways that are hard to explain. The healing is not always in the darkness itself, but in what the darkness allows. It allows the sleep cycles to unfold with less interruption. It allows dreams to emerge from a more stable architecture. It allows memory and emotion to be processed overnight rather than merely carried forward unchanged. It allows the brain to stop living entirely in reaction mode and remember how to recover. If this slow kind of science is becoming part of your own nighttime rhythm, you can always leave a like, subscribe, or simply keep listening. Some ideas are best heard when the lights are low and the day has stopped asking quite so much. There is another quiet truth here as well. Not every dream is meaningful in the same way, and not every remembered fragment needs interpretation. Sometimes the sleeping brain is simply making associations, blending residues, playing with memory fragments in loose and nonlinear form. But that does not make dreams pointless. It just means their value may lie less in direct translation and more in the fact that they are evidence of a brain still actively processing life. You do not need to decode every dream to benefit from dreaming. In the same way, you do not need to remember every cycle of sleep for those cycles to have helped you. The brain knows how to do much of this work without your conscious supervision. What it asks from you is simpler. Give it a convincing night. Give it enough darkness. Give it enough continuity. And it will often do the rest with extraordinary intelligence. That is one of the most hopeful parts of sleep science. The body is not waiting for perfect control. It is waiting for cooperation. It already knows how to cycle, how to repair, how to consolidate, how to soften emotional edges, how to dream, how to process. Our job is often not to command it, but to stop interrupting it quite so much. Darkness is one of the kindest ways to stop interrupting it. As we come toward the end of this part, there is a natural next step. We have talked about darkness as signal, timing cue, protector of deep sleep, and supporter of dreams and memory. The final question is practical and reassuring. If all of this is true, what should a person actually do? How do you build a sleep environment that works with the body rather than against it? How dark should the room be? What light should be reduced? What evening patterns matter most? And how can a modern person reclaim more believable night without becoming obsessive? That is where we go next. For now, just imagine the brain during a dark, uninterrupted night. Not absent, not empty. Quietly busy, sorting the day, softening its edges, cleaning its own pathways, letting dreams rise and fall, letting memory settle into place, letting the self become a little more whole again by morning. Darkness does not do that work alone, but it gives the brain the kind of night in which such work can finally begin. Part 10. Building the ideal dark sleep environment. By now, the shape of the story is probably clear. Darkness is not nothing. It is not just the empty space left behind when the lights go off. It is a signal the brain has been trained to trust. A condition that helps the body clock keep time. A support for melatonin. A protector of deeper sleep. A quiet ally of dreams, memory, and restoration. It is one half of an ancient rhythm the human nervous system still depends on, even if modern life often forgets that fact. And once you understand that, the final question becomes beautifully simple. How do you actually build a night your brain can believe in? Not a perfect life. Not a monastic routine. Not a fragile system where one mistake ruins everything. Just a believable night. A room, an evening, and a set of small habits that make it easier for the body to stop arguing with the day and finally let go. That is the goal. Because the truth is, most people do not need to become sleep experts. They do not need to memorize hormone charts, buy a collection of expensive gadgets, or turn bedtime into a high-pressure performance. Very often, what helps most is something much quieter. A few changes that remove contradiction. A few choices that make the environment easier for the nervous system to understand. The body is not asking for drama. It is asking for coherence. That may be the single most useful word in this whole topic. Coherence. A bright enough day. A dimmer evening. A darker sleeping space. Less confusion. Less visual noise. Less accidental daylight at midnight. The brain loves coherence because coherence reduces the need for constant interpretation. When the environment makes sense, the body can respond more smoothly. When the environment sends mixed messages, the body has to negotiate. And negotiation is tiring. So let us imagine, slowly and practically, what an ideal dark sleep environment really looks like. Not in the abstract. Not in a magazine photograph. In the lived sense. The first thing to understand is that the sleep environment does not begin at the moment you get into bed. It begins earlier than that. In many ways, the bedroom is only the final chamber of the night. By the time you arrive there, the nervous system has already been reading the light story of the evening for an hour or two. If that story has been loud, bright, and visually demanding, the bedroom inherits some of that momentum. If the story has been calmer, dimmer, and more gradual, the bedroom receives a softer nervous system. This means the ideal dark sleep environment has two parts: the room itself, and the descent into the room. Both matter. Let us start with the descent. One of the kindest things you can do for the brain in the evening is to let the light in your environment begin changing before sleep is supposed to happen. Not all at once. Not with some dramatic ritual unless you enjoy that. Just a gradual lowering of visual intensity. Lamps instead of overhead lighting. Warmer tones instead of colder, sharper ones. Less brightness in your direct field of vision. Fewer screens close to the face. Fewer moments when the eyes are forced to read bright, active information late into the evening. This is not because the body is delicate. It is because it is responsive. When evening light remains bright and day-like until the final minute, the body has less chance to slope downward naturally. Sleep becomes a cliff. The person is awake, 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 and then trying to suddenly be asleep. But the body tends to prefer a hill, not a cliff. It likes signals that taper. A dimmer room. A softer visual world. A reduction in stimulation. Evening that actually looks like evening. There is something deeply human about that. You can feel it in small ways. A room with a lamp in the corner often changes conversation. People speak a little more softly. Their attention turns inward a little more easily. The body does not always become sleepy right away, but it stops being pushed so insistently toward outward engagement. That is the beginning of a believable night. Once the evening begins to dim, the bedroom itself matters more. And here, the simplest principle is this: make the room as dark as reasonably possible while still feeling comfortable and safe. That is the most practical version of the science. Not obsessive darkness. Not anxious darkness. Just real darkness, reduced contradiction, and fewer biologically loud light sources. Many people underestimate how many small lights live in a bedroom. You do not really notice them until you start looking for them. The digital clock, the charger light, the power strip, the television standby light, the router in the corner, the air purifier button, the alarm on a device you forgot about, the streak of street light through the curtains, the hallway glow under the door, the tiny pulse from something in sleep mode. Individually, each one may look trivial. Together, they can turn night into a lower-grade version of day. So the first practical step is wonderfully low-tech. Do a darkness audit. Not during the day, when everything disappears into ordinary brightness. At night, turn the main lights off, let your eyes adapt for a few minutes, and then simply look. Notice what remains. Notice which little lights call the eye. Which cracks of brightness fall across the room? Which devices keep declaring themselves to the darkness? The point is not to become paranoid. The point is to see the room the way the night sees it. And once you do, the solutions are often almost laughably simple. Turn the clock away. Cover the charger light. Tape over the power indicator. Move the device. Close the gap. Shift the angle. The body often responds to these tiny changes more than people expect, not because it is dramatic, but because nighttime physiology works best when contradiction is removed at the source. Then there are curtains. Blackout curtains are not glamorous advice, but they are among the most useful tools for many bedrooms, especially in cities or places with outdoor lighting. A curtain that meaningfully blocks street light, early dawn glare, or exterior security lights can transform the brain's relationship to the room. It turns an exposed space into a protected one. It helps the night feel like night for longer. It reduces the chance that the room will brighten before the body is ready. If blackout curtains are not possible, even thicker curtains, better fitted blinds, or layering fabric can make a significant difference. Again, perfection is not required. Improvement matters. The same is true for the bottom of the door. A surprising amount of hallway light can leak into a room through a gap low to the floor. A draft stopper, a rolled towel, a better seal, or even a slight shift in routine can reduce that intrusion. Small interventions matter because nighttime light is read in context. A line of brightness may not seem important by day, but in a dark room it becomes a signal. Another practical choice concerns the route to the bathroom or kitchen at night. Many people flip on bright overhead lights during the nighttime waking without thinking much about it. That is understandable. You want to see. You do not want to trip. Safety matters. But if that route can be made gentler, the body often benefits. A dim, warm light placed low. A softer lamp. Even just avoiding the brightest possible switch when you are only awake for a moment. The goal is not to stumble in darkness. The goal is to stop flooding the system with unnecessary daytime like brightness in the middle of the biological night. Night vision is easy to destroy and slower to rebuild. The nervous system notices abrupt light at odd hours. So if you can make those nighttime interruptions visually gentler, sleep often becomes easier to return to. Then there is the phone. It is hard to talk about sleep honestly without talking about the phone, because for many people it is the last light they see and the first light they see again if they wake. It is not only a source of brightness. It is a source of information, anticipation, emotion, novelty, and social activation. It is visual stimulation tied to meaning, which is an especially potent combination for a brain trying to descend into sleep. The kindest solution is usually not complicated. Get the phone away from the bed if you can, or at least out of immediate reach, or at least face down, with notifications silenced, brightness reduced, and the habit of checking interrupted before sleep begins. The closer the device is to the pillow, the easier it becomes for night to become punctured. One glance at the time, one message, one scroll, one bright rectangle in the face, one more burst of information when the brain was hoping for darkness and continuity. The brain does not need moral discipline here as much as it needs environmental design. The farther away the cue, the easier it is not to respond. We tend to think of self-control as something internal and heroic. But with sleep, external design often matters more. Put the stimulation farther from the sleeping body, and the body often becomes wiser without having to try so hard. The same principle applies to televisions in the bedroom. Some people find them comforting. That comfort is real. But if the goal is a convincing night, then a television that flickers, changes brightness, and continues telling stories into sleep is not neutral. It extends wakefulness into the room, even if you fall asleep to it. So if removing the television entirely is not realistic, then setting a timer, dimming the brightness, or replacing it with something gentler, like audio without changing light, may be a more biologically peaceful compromise. This brings us to another overlooked part of the ideal sleep environment. The room should ask less of you. That may sound vague, but it is deeply practical. A room full of visual clutter, blinking indicators, bright devices, loud colors, active screens, and harsh light keeps the mind closer to task mode. A room that is quieter visually tends to help the body release. Simpler surfaces. Softer light in the pre-sleep period. Darkness when sleep begins. Less demand. Less decision. Less visual insistence. In a strange way, the best sleep environment is not necessarily the one with the most features. It is the one with the fewest arguments. That is why darkness is so useful. Darkness removes argument. It says there is nothing more to look at now. Nothing more to assess. The visible world has receded. You may let go. There is another element worth mentioning, though it is not about light directly. Temperature and darkness often work together. A cool room and a dark room both tell the body that night is real. They create a certain integrity of signal. This does not mean cold discomfort. It means a room that supports the natural nighttime tendency toward cooling rather than fighting it with heat and bright visual stimulation at the same time. In other words, the more the environment resembles actual nighttime conditions, the less work the body has to do to interpret it. And that is really the whole point. Make night legible. That may be the most practical sentence in this entire conclusion. Make night legible. Make it easy for the nervous system to read the room and understand what phase of the world it is in. This also means consistency matters more than occasional perfection. One perfect dark night in an otherwise chaotic lighting schedule is nice, but a more consistent pattern usually helps more over time. A reasonably dim evening most nights. A darker room most nights. Morning light most days if possible. Less screen brightness late. The body responds to repeated patterns. It learns. It begins to anticipate. And anticipation is one of the great gifts of a well-supported circadian system. Eventually, the room itself starts meaning something to the nervous system. It becomes associated not with entertainment, work, or endless scrolling, but with descent, with inwardness, with rest. The body enters and begins to soften before you even consciously decide to sleep. That is not laziness. That is conditioning in the best sense. The nervous system has learned the environment, and that learning can be incredibly powerful. Some people find it helpful to create a small evening sequence that pairs with the darker room. Nothing elaborate. Just a few repeated actions that tell the body what is coming. Lower the lights. Put the phone away. Close the curtains. Brush your teeth. Read something calm under a dim lamp. Then lights out. Sequence itself becomes a signal. The body loves repeated patterns. They reduce uncertainty. Sleep often becomes easier when it no longer has to begin from scratch every night. There is also something gentle to say to people who cannot control their environments completely. Maybe you live in a city with strong outdoor light. Maybe you share a room. Maybe your work hours are irregular. Maybe your home situation is noisy, bright, or complicated. That is real. The goal is not to pretend perfect conditions are always possible. The goal is to improve signal quality where you can. A sleep mask can help if the room cannot be darkened enough. Thicker curtains can help if the windows leak light. A towel under the door can help if the hallway is bright. Turning off one device matters, even if you cannot control the street outside. A dimmer routine matters, even if the room is not perfect. Biology benefits from gradients. Better is still better. That may be one of the most reassuring truths in sleep. You do not need a flawless cave in the mountains. You need a more believable night than the one your body is getting now. That is often enough to make a real difference. And once the environment becomes more believable, the body often begins doing the rest with surprising intelligence. Sleep comes a little easier. Night waking feels less jarring. Morning may feel less heavy. Dreams may feel richer or simply more peaceful. The mind may feel a little more gathered the next day. Not because darkness is miraculous, but because darkness removed one of the unnecessary frictions between your ancient biology and your modern room. At the heart of all this is a very simple shift in perspective. Most people think of darkness as the lack of something useful. But in sleep, darkness is useful. It is not deprivation. It is support. It is the condition that allows the body clock to stay honest, melatonin to rise more confidently, deep sleep to settle more fully, dreams and memory processing to unfold with more continuity, and the nervous system to stop negotiating with the possibility that day may still be happening. Darkness is not what remains when life is over for the day. Darkness is part of how the body finishes the day well. If this kind of calm science has helped you tonight, you can always leave a like, subscribe, or share where you're listening from. It's always quietly beautiful to imagine different rooms, different cities, different nights, all connected by the same human need for rest. And now, as we come to the end of this journey, let us gather the story together one last time. We began with a tiny, ordinary light, a charger, a clock, a faint glow that looked almost too small to matter. And from there, we followed the trail inward, into the eye, into the retina, into the brain's reading of light as timing, into the body clock, into melatonin, into the ways artificial light can confuse the night, into deep sleep, dreams, memory, and the long evolutionary history of a species shaped under real darkness. What we found, again and again, was this. The brain does not treat darkness as emptiness. It treats darkness as information, as permission, as a signal that the visible world has stepped back far enough for the inner work of night to begin. That is why your brain needs darkness. Not because darkness is trendy. Not because sleep advice says so. Not because humans are fragile. But because darkness is one of the oldest and clearest forms of nighttime truth your biology has ever known. And perhaps the most comforting part of that truth is how simple the invitation really is. You do not have to master sleep. You do not have to force the night. You do not have to control every variable. You only have to become a little kinder to the signals your body has been listening for all along. A little more daylight in the day. A little less brightness late. A little more darkness in the room. A little more trust in the body's old intelligence. That is enough to begin. So tonight, when the lights go low and the room starts to soften, maybe you can think of darkness differently. Not as a void. Not as absence. But as a gentle, ancient condition your brain has been waiting for. A kind of quiet instruction from the world itself. The day is over now. You may let go. And before we end, I'll leave you with one last soft question. If you could remove just one source of light from your nighttime routine or your bedroom tonight, what would it be? The phone, the clock, the street light through the curtain, the hallway glow. Sometimes one small change is all it takes to make the night feel more real. For now, just let the room grow darker in your imagination. Let the visible world ask less of you. Let the brain stop checking. Let the old rhythm return. And let darkness, finally, do the quiet work it was always meant to do.